Mom, don't contact us anymore. Our whole family needs space. The text from my son arrived on the night of my 67th birthday, right as I was setting a chocolate mousse cake, his childhood favorite, on the dining table. I had waited for him all day. Every time a car passed, I looked up. Every time my phone buzzed, I let myself hope. And then what I got was a cold sentence passed on a mother's love. The doorbell rang. My daughter-in-law stood there with a blade-thin smile and a folder in her hand. Guardianship papers. Sign them so I can take better care of you. I looked into her eyes, and in that instant I understood. What they wanted to keep wasn't me, it was the $50 million I control. Sign? No. I smiled, opened a drawer, and pressed the tiny recorder button under the wooden table. They didn't know that the very moment they thought they were cutting me out was when I began erasing them from my life. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. My name is Estelle Raymond, 67, widowed 8 years. I live alone in an old Upper East Side apartment, the home Grant, my late husband, and I shared for 3 decades. He died of a stroke while golfing in Arizona. In that moment, my world collapsed, but at least I still had my son Adrian, the one remaining hope. Grant was calm, practical, and good at investing. He didn't leave a gushy will. He built a family trust with asset protection terms. I'm the primary beneficiary with full authority over the income real estate shares, stocks, bonds, and an investment fund worth about $50 million. When he died, people said I was lucky. But losing your partner and being left with only money that isn't luck, it's a test. I once thought at least I still had my son and a family. To fill the emptiness, I started giving too much, too easily. In the first year after Grant died, Adrian got divorced. I paid his attorney fees and rented him an apartment in Westchester so he could stabilize. A year. Later, he remarried Tessa, a young, beautiful, sharp woman who used to work in PR, and I foolishly paid for the lavish Long Island wedding. I gifted them a honeymoon in Italy and covered the down payment on their new house in Westport, the place they called our dream home. I did it all not to show off, but because I thought that was love. I wanted my son never to struggle the way his parents once had. I didn't realize that when you give without asking for gratitude, people start treating kindness like an obligation. Every Thanksgiving, Christmas, or birthday, I prepped gifts, checks, transfers. All they had to say was, "Mom, we're a bit tight," and I opened my wallet. A walking ATM, like people joke online, maybe that was me. But this year was different. My kitchen tonight was still, lit only by candles flickering against Grant's framed photo. The chocolate mousse cake smelled rich, its surface still glossy. I had mixed the batter with arthritic hands, each stir a memory of when Adrian was small, a curly-haired boy grinning wide, begging for the biggest slice with the most frosting. I'd texted him in the morning, "Birthday cake is ready. Come by any time." No reply. By afternoon, I told myself he was busy. That night, when the clock struck 8 p.m., I turned on the porch light and set out plates for 3, me, Adrian, and Tessa. Each time a car went by, I stood up, heart racing, only to be disappointed. When the text, "Mom, don't contact us anymore, our whole family needs space," appeared, I thought I'd misread it. I sat frozen, watched the candle tremble and go out. Only me remained and the truth. I had lost my son. Not for lack of love, but for loving too much. 3 days later, the cake still sat there. No one came. No birthday wish. Not a single flower. On the 4th day, I lifted the lid. The cream had turned sour. I wiped my eyes and scraped it into the trash, the spoon clanging against the sink like metal, striking my heart. I didn't know if I was crying for the cake, for my son, or for myself. But I knew this. Every illusion had to be thrown out like that cake. I sat at the table, pulled out my expense notebook, and turned to the old pages. $80,000 for the first divorce fees, $40,000 for the honeymoon, $200,000 for the Westport down payment, $12,000 a year for Maya and Owen's tuition, plus hundreds of thousands more for holidays, gifts, birthdays. I wrote the total, more than $1 million. Next to it, I added a small line, number of times you asked, "Mom, are you okay?" 0. That wasn't just financial math. It was an indictment. Adrian, the boy who once held my hand through Central Park, who promised, "I'll take care of you when I grow up," now called only when he needed money. Tessa, the daughter-in-law who hugged me after the wedding and said, "I'm so happy to have a mom like you," now met me with a cold gaze, a smile on her lips but not in her eyes. At family dinners, I sat at the head of the table while they talked renovations, school choices, vacations, all paid with my money, yet no one asked my opinion. I'd become a decoration in their lives. My grandkids Maya, 13, and Owen, 11, were polite and well-mannered but distant, as if I were a guest. I suspect Tessa taught them that polite is enough. They'd say grandma and then go back to their phones. I don't blame them. Children reflect what adults teach. I used to think that as long as they were happy, it was fine if I took the loss. But that text was a wake-up call. "Mom, don't contact us anymore." I read it once, twice, 3 times. Each reading sent the pain in reverse from my heart to my throat, lodging there. In that moment, I understood. They didn't need me. They needed my money. And if they could sever things with a text, I had the right to sever back, not with words, but with action. I stood, went to the kitchen cabinet. In a small metal box under the drawer, I opened the lid. Inside was a mini recorder Grant once gave me, "In case you ever need proof during negotiations." I placed it beneath the dining table. I knew sooner or later Adrian and Tessa would come back, not because they missed me, but because of money matters. And when they did, I would let the truth speak for itself. That night I brewed orange blossom tea and sat by the window looking down at the street. Below, headlights stretched on, horns blared. People rushed while I sat in an apartment once full of laughter, now hearing only the tick of a clock. Strangely, for the first time in years, I felt clear-headed. Not a wounded mother, but a woman waking from a long sleep called sacrifice. I looked at Grant's photo and whispered, "You once told me that if someone treats my kindness as a given, I must teach them the value of loss." I smiled. Maybe today is that day. I turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow of a half-melted birthday candle. Then I opened my notebook and wrote on a fresh page, "The Estelle plan starting today." If someone asked me, "What made you endure all those years?" I wouldn't answer right away. Because honestly, I didn't feel like I was enduring, at least not then. I thought I was giving, and in a widowed mother's heart, giving felt like the only way to feel needed. 10 years ago, after Grant passed, my world became too quiet. The Park Avenue apartment, white walls, polished wood floors once filled with the jazz he played every afternoon, now had only the hiss of the heater. At first, I couldn't stand the silence. I left the TV on all night, kept the hallway lights on, trying to fool myself someone was home. Then Adrian started stopping by more often. My only son tall, with his father's face, a warm voice. Each time he came, the apartment seemed to breathe again. He'd say, "Mom, I don't want you to be lonely. I just need to know you're okay." I believed it. While he talked, I'd pour tea, set out cookies, and feel myself calm. But gradually, those visits began with different openings. "Mom, I've got a little issue at the office." "Mom, my attorney says I need a retainer." "Mom, I'm house hunting, but Westport is expensive." Those moms made me feel useful. And in the emptiness of grief, being needed is a sedative. I wrote checks, made transfers, sent cash, paid bills not because I was forced, but because I believed love was continuing, just changing shape. I didn't realize the more I gave, the more I erased myself. The Park Avenue apartment where Grant and I lived more than 30 years sits along a boulevard washed in lights. Every corner holds a memory. There, I cooked dinner, listened to Grant talk markets, risk, and conviction. He always told me, money only matters when it's put in the right place, Estelle. Don't let it buy silence. I heard him then, but I didn't understand. Only when I compared it with the Westport house, where I paid nearly all the down payment, did I grasp what it means to buy silence. That house is beautiful, modern, with a wide yard and glass doors opening to a lawn smooth as silk. I remember the first day Adrian and Tessa took me to see it, both of them beaming like kids in a candy shop. "Mom, this is where our kids will grow up. This is our family's home." I smiled and signed a check for $200,000, never reading the small line below. The sponsor has no ownership rights. After that, every Sunday I drove nearly an hour from Manhattan to Westport for family dinner. I always brought Tessa's favorite dish, a bottle of wine from Grant's collection, and the hope that there'd be warmth there. But family dinner soon turned into a presentation. Adrian talked work. Tessa discussed redoing the kitchen, switching to Italian floors, repainting the living room. They called it upgrading the space. I knew better than anyone, upgrading with my money. They didn't ask what I wanted to eat. They just asked me to transfer funds before the contractors come this weekend. Each time, I smiled, nodded, and drove home in silence. I told myself, it's fine, as long as my son is happy. But the truth is, I no longer knew what happiness even meant. My attorney, Harold Benton, was the person Grant trusted most. He helped manage the trust, taxes, and investments. After Grant died, Harold checked in often with updates. "Mrs. Estelle," he once said, "I advise you to keep control. Don't let any expense become automatic." But I had Harold set up monthly transfers for Adrian, living costs, the kids' tuition, and even Tessa's credit cards. I said, "I just want them not to worry." Harold sighed but did it. Every month, numbers left my accounts automatically, and every month, the bond between me and my son left automatically too. In those 8 years, I helped Adrian save face more times than I can count. When he owed taxes, I wrote a check. When his car got towed for unpaid fees, I paid it. When he forgot Tessa's birthday, I booked the party. When they fought, I watched the kids so they could get a break. And through all those times, no one remembered my birthday. Year after year, late texts, or sometimes just an emoji. I told myself young people are busy, that I was asking too much. But there is a limit when you have to light your own birthday candle alone. Every excuse rings hollow. My friend Marjorie Hale, who lives 2 blocks away, once said over tea, "Estelle, giving without teaching is harm. You're not helping your son. You're making him believe you're a zero-interest bank." I laughed, sipped tea, and joked, "He's still my son, Marjorie. I can't just let him stumble." She looked at me, kind but firm, "But if you always catch him, he'll never learn to stand." Back then, I thought she was too strict. Now I know she was right word for word. The warning signs started last year. Adrian visited less, though I'm only an hour away. Whenever I called, he answered shortly, "I'm in a meeting." Tessa stayed polite, but her gaze had changed. One evening, when I offered to help fix their pool, she smiled and said, "You don't need to worry, Mom. You should focus on your health. Maybe you should let financial professionals manage your assets so you can relax." Her voice was sweet enough that, if you didn't listen closely, it sounded caring. But I heard something else, a shady intent under the sugar. That night, I opened my laptop and checked my bank accounts. Transfers steady, month after month. Money flowing out like water, and I had no idea how long I'd let the river run. I opened my notebook and began listing every gift from the last 8 years. Columns of numbers stretched on, nearly $2 million if I counted gifts, travel, and side investments. When I wrote the last line, my hand shook not from regret over money, but from seeing myself there, a woman who had erased herself with unconditional generosity. I sat very still. Only the clock ticked. I looked around the apartment, once full of laughter, now only Grant's smile in an oak frame. If he were alive, he wouldn't scold me, but he would ask, "Estelle, have you forgotten that kindness needs boundaries?" I touched the frame and answered in my heart, "Maybe I did forget, but I'll remember again, starting today." I closed the notebook, wiped my tears, then picked up my phone and opened contacts. Harold Benton's name lit up. I called, "Harold, I need to see you. As soon as possible." His voice was calm as ever. "What's going on, Mrs. Estelle?" I took a breath and spoke slowly, word by word. "I want to review everything. Every transfer, every authorization, every clause in the trust. I think it's time to turn the page." I hung up, stood, and made another cup of tea. For the first time in years, I didn't feel weak sitting alone. I felt clear, and I knew, if my wallet used to be a symbol of love, from today it would be a symbol of boundaries. The next morning I went to Harold's Midtown office. That building marble lobby, a hint of Arabica in the air, was where Grant and I sat with him for years discussing investments. But today wasn't about stocks or returns. Today I came to take back control. Harold looked at me over half-rimmed glasses, speaking gently. "Are you sure, Estelle? Pausing the automatic transfers will trigger a lot of reactions." I smiled and set my teacup down. Reactions are exactly what I need. No one knows the value of water until it's shut off. I signed the document stopping all automatic payments. The Westport mortgage, tuition, Tessa's credit cards, even Adrian's living stipend. As of today, that stream would stop. Harold nodded slowly. "I've never seen you this resolute. Maybe because I finally understand love isn't measured by a bank balance." I left the office and stepped onto the street. Early March air, cold and dry, filled my lungs, and I felt strangely light. I didn't say a word to Adrian. No text, no email, no call. They never asked if I was okay. I didn't need to warn them. I was about to change. At first, everything was quiet. On the third day, my voicemail filled up. "Mom, I think there's a bank glitch." The mortgage bounced. "Mom, Tessa says her card was declined at the store." "Can you check?" "Mom, maybe I messed up the transfer. Could you call Harold?" I listened to all of it and said nothing. Outside, the sky stayed gray, but in my kitchen, the morning light warmed a white porcelain cup. For the first time in years, I didn't feel dragged by guilt. By the sixth day, Adrian's voice lost its calm. "Mom," I called Harold. He said it was on your instruction. "Mom, what's happening? Please, at least tell me why." His voice held confusion, anger, and something I hadn't heard in a long time, fear. I turned on the answering machine and let it record everything. I wanted to hear the shift in tone from certainty to unease to desperation. On the seventh day, exactly 7:30 a.m., spanned pounding hit my door. I checked the clock, straightened my cream cardigan, and put on the pearl necklace Grant gave me on our 25th anniversary. I didn't rush. I walked slowly to the door. Adrian stood there, gaunt face, crooked tie, eyes mixed with anger and worry. Tessa beside him, hair in a tight bun, beige fur coat, gripping a designer bag like she was holding her dignity together. I opened the door, my voice light as if they were visiting on a regular morning. "Good morning, you two. Come in." Adrian strode inside. Tessa followed, lips pressed thin. "Mom, what is going on?" "What do you mean, dear?" I said, calmly pouring coffee. "All the payments have stopped. The mortgage, credit cards, Maya's tuition, everything. The bank says the stop order came from you. That's right, I said, setting the cup down evenly. I need to review a few things. Tessa let out a cold laugh. You can't just do that. That's our money. I turned and met her eyes. Sorry, sweetheart, but no. It's money I earned, I manage, and I pay taxes on. You've been beneficiaries, not heirs. The room went heavy. I pulled out a chair, sat at the table, and opened my brown leather notebook full of neat entries. Adrian, I said, do you know how much I've transferred to your household over 8 years? Mom, I didn't count. I did, I answered, flipping pages, my voice steady. A total of $1,842,000. That includes tuition, housing, insurance, travel, holidays, birthdays. And that's just the documented amounts. I looked up at the two of them. Frozen. Now I want you to see another sheet. I slid a printed page from an envelope. Number of visits to see me in 8 years, 32. Number of calls asking, Mom, are you okay? 7. Number of calls asking for money, transfers, or complaining about expenses, 43. I set the paper down. The rustle sounded loud in the silent kitchen. See? I said quietly. This scale has been tilted far too long. Adrian dropped into a chair, fingers in his hair. Mom, I know. I've been careless. But you can't just cut us off like this. The house, the car, the kids' tuition, everything depends on that money. I looked at him, caught between pity and exhaustion. That's exactly why I had to stop. If everything depends on me, you're not the man of your family, Tessa cut in sharp. What about this month's mortgage, food, school, the car? How do you expect us to manage? I stood, walked unhurriedly to the coffee machine. The way millions of families do, Tessa. Live within your means. Adrian has a job. And you, I paused, turned, and smiled lightly. You can get one. Tessa glared. She started to speak, then swallowed it. That answer seemed to choke her. I set 2 hot coffees on the table and sat across from them. I'm not cutting you off, I'm pausing. And I have a proposal. Both looked up. I opened my notebook and pulled out a folded page. For the next 30 days, I want you to prove I'm still family, not a walking wallet. Not with apologies or gifts, but with simple actions. Call because you want to know how I'm doing, invite me to dinner for no reason at all, or send a real card with no transfer request attached. Tessa let out a bitter laugh. Are you turning love into a test, Mom? I answered without blinking. No. I just want to know if there's any love left to save. Adrian looked at his wife, then back at me. Mom, I promise. We'll do better. I know I've forgotten what matters. I nodded. I hope so, but remember, if I sense this is just acting, just a performance to get the money back, then everything ends for good. No more chances. Silence stretched on. Only the wall clock ticked off each beat. Then Tessa spoke, her voice low, no longer hard. In the meantime, who pays the bills, Estelle? I looked at her, my eyes softer but my tone firm. Someone who's spent for 8 years without earning $1 can certainly learn to spend less for 30 days. And Adrian, I turned to my son, you have a job, a salary. It's time to live on your own steam. I stood, ending the conversation. 30 days. After that, I'll decide whether it's worth turning the money back on. They stood too, saying nothing. When the door closed behind them, I stayed seated, listening to their footsteps fade down the hall. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a strange quiet settle over the apartment, quiet-like after you shut off a water valve and still hear the last little drips in the pipes. That was the sound of dependency dying and of a mother beginning to learn how to love herself. I didn't have to wait long for the play to begin. Only 3 days after that shut-off morning, the phone rang. Adrian's name lit up on the screen, along with a photo of him grinning beside his wife and kids, the picture I kept as my wallpaper for years but deleted long ago. I let it ring to the third chime before picking up. His voice was gentle, almost too gentle, like he was reading a rehearsed line. "Mom, I just wanted to check on you. You've been quiet lately. Are you eating enough?" I had to pause a few seconds not to laugh. My Adrian, the one who hadn't asked, "Mom, how are you?" in 3 years, suddenly cared about my nutrition. I answered evenly, "I'm fine. Thanks for asking." He paused, then continued, his tone almost too smooth. "I realize I've been awful. You've carried so much for us. I just want you to know I'm grateful." Someone who didn't know better might be moved. But I could hear paper rustling on his end, and Tessa's faint whisper behind him, prompting something. I spoke slowly, to let them believe I was softening. "I know, Adrian. Thank you. Take care of yourself." I hung up and checked the time. 37 minutes later, the phone rang again, this time a blocked number. A young voice came through, trembling slightly like recitation. "Hi, Grandma. It's Maya. I just wanted to tell you about my day at school." I leaned back and listened as my granddaughter talked nonstop about math class, a new teacher, a science project. Every detail was too perfect, too polished, like a carefully assigned script. I let her finish, then asked gently, "Maya, who told you to call Grandma?" A brief silence, then her voice dropped. "Dad said you were sad. Mom said to call so you'd know the family still loves you." I sighed softly. "I understand." "Maya, listen. I'll always be your grandma. Do you hear me? Whether the adults are upset or not, that never changes." "Yes. Do you want to keep talking, or do you have homework to do?" I have homework." "Then go study, sweetheart. I love you." "I love you too." I hung up, my heart sinking. I wasn't angry at Maya, only tender toward her. A child being pulled into a grown-up performance with her own clear little voice. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. The delivery guy stood outside, arms full of white lilies and pale pink roses so big he had to angle them through the doorway. A card tied with silver ribbon read, "Thinking of Mom with all my love. Tessa." I set the bouquet on the table, its sweetness almost choking. I remembered that even on my birthday, this woman had never sent flowers, never even called. Now that the money was shut off, she suddenly remembered motherly love. I snapped a photo of the bouquet, sent it to Harold with a note. "First signal. They've started performing." 2 days later, Tessa called. Her voice was bright, tinged with a shy friendliness, like she was trying to bond. "Mom, I know it's a busy week, but I'd love to take you out for a girls' day. Spa, nails, a little shopping, what do you think?" I smiled lightly. The same person who once mocked my dress as outdated in front of her friends now wanted a girls' day? "Sounds lovely, Tessa, but I'm a bit tied up this week." "I'll check my calendar." "Okay, take your time. I just want us to be closer. I've been thinking a lot." Her voice trailed off, then the line clicked. I watched the afternoon light filter through the vase on the table, lily petals making soft halos. Beautiful, yes, but beauty with a price tag. And I knew with Tessa, everything had a price, even affection. On the 8th day, the post office delivered a pale blue envelope. The scrawled line read, "To Grandma Estelle from Owen." Inside was a handwritten note. The penmanship was even careful, spotless, oddly so, unlike the hurried scrawl I'd seen from him on Christmas cards. "Grandma, I think you're wonderful. I'm sorry I don't say it more. I hope to see you soon. You're the best grandma in the world. I love you. Owen." I read it again and again, studying the strokes. Every letter was overly sculpted, the lines too straight, as if someone had guided his hand until it was perfect. It made me smile and ache at the same time. That evening I called Adrian. He picked up fast, hope in his voice. "Mom, I knew you'd call. I'm guessing the flowers moved you, right?" "The flowers are lovely, and Owen's letter is sweet," I said slowly. "But both smell of staging." "Mom, what are you saying?" "Adrian, listen to me clearly. If you truly want to repair this, start with honesty. Don't use the kids as tools to ask for money. Don't hand them scripts to read. I've lived long enough to hear the difference between truth and performance, silence on the other end. I could picture him glancing at Tessa, signaling her to be quiet, afraid I might hear something. "There's just one thing I want you to remember," I added, softer. "If these 30 days are real, I'll know. If they're just a show, I'll know that too. And then this door will close for good." I hung up before he could answer. Late at night, I brewed orange blossom tea and sat in the dining room, the warm lamp casting gold over the wood table. I reached under the table to the tiny recorder I'd stuck there last week. A small green light blinked, still powered, still working. I slipped on headphones and replayed the morning they came over. Tessa's sharp voice, "That's our money." Adrian's sigh, "Mom, at least tell me. What's going on?" Then, me steady, calm. Hearing myself, I felt no regret. I opened a new audio file, the calls from today. Every tone, every breath, every awkward pause from my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandkids captured. Part of me felt sad. I once dreamed our family would keep warm memories, not cold audio files. But another part knew, this is the truth. And truth, even when cold, deserves to be kept more than sweet lies do. Have you ever had to smile through a play you never signed up to watch? If you have, leave a line, just one line. I want to know how closely you recognize that feeling. I set the headphones down, turned off the lights, leaving only the small glow over the stove. Outside, New York slipped into spring rain, cars slicing through puddles. I closed my eyes and listened to the rain mingle with the even hum of the recorder. I thought of Grant and what he once said, "Never confuse love with bribery. Once people know you fear loneliness, they'll turn it into a weapon." I smiled. Grant was right. But maybe this time, the weapon is in my hands. The next day, I woke early. Thin sunlight slid through the curtains. I set the kettle on, opened my laptop, and backed up every recording to a separate drive. Folder name, Opening Act. I knew this was just the first scene. And the writer this time wasn't Adrian or Tessa. It was me. Marjorie's text arrived at midday as I finished brewing tea and rearranging the lilies that had begun to droop. My old friend never minced words. "Estelle, I was at the country club yesterday." Tessa sat with the tennis ladies. She spoke softly but just loud enough for the whole table. "My mother-in-law's been odd lately, impulsive spending, not stable since her husband died. We might have to bring in an expert to assess capacity." I froze, the flower stem slipping in my hand. A petal snapped against the crystal with a click. Marjorie lowered her voice. "I'm not telling you to hurt you, but you need to know they're laying the road for a different script." "Thank you," I said. Two small words felt like stones in a dry throat. I hung up and stood still for a long moment, listening to the clock beat against the wall. In my head, the pieces clicked into place. Flowers, the handwritten note, the check-in calls. Then the club whispers one side, painting the picture of devoted children trying to care, the other casting me as the erratic widow, difficult, with strange spending. If people heard only half the story, they'd side with the dutiful child. I dialed Harold Benton. He picked up almost instantly. "Harold, answer me honestly. Has anyone at all called your office asking about my financial capacity or mental competency?" A beat of silence. I heard him set his glasses down. "Estelle, I shouldn't disclose informal inquiries. But since you asked," Adrian called. "He said you'd made a few unusual financial decisions." asked about capacity evaluations and guardianship mechanisms, and what the first steps would be. The floor seemed to tilt under me. Strangely, instead of breaking, everything inside me went still. "What did you tell him, Harold?" "I said you are fully lucid, and that any move to limit your capacity would waste time and money and could backfire in court. I also told him if he truly cares, he should start by checking on his mother." "Thank you," I said, my voice steady again. "We have more work to do." I hung up and looked down at the busy avenue. The first sharp pain sealed like a cut under a clean bandage. It was clear now. The pricey bouquet, the painstaking note, the gentle calls were props. They were building a backdrop. We care so much. While up close, they shoved me into the role of unstable mother. I poured more tea. The steam fogged the glass. In that haze, I saw my reflection no longer trembling. If they wanted to play on the legal field, that's exactly where I'd meet them. That afternoon, I called Dr. Lila Khan's office, the neurocognitive specialist Harold once mentioned. The assistant asked a few screening questions. The earliest slot was next Wednesday, a half-day comprehensive assessment. Memory, attention, executive function, plus a clinical interview. "We'll send an official appointment letter and the documents to bring." "Thank you," I added, clearly on purpose. The results must be stamped and suitable for court filings. I hung up, marked the date in red, and wrote beneath it, "Calm is the first piece of proof." That evening, I called Maya. It rang a long time. I guessed she was deep in homework. Finally, a young voice. "Grandma? Finished studying, Maya?" Almost." I paused a second, then chose the gentlest way to say it. "I want you to know this. The grown-ups have grown-up problems. You don't need to call Grandma as a duty. Call if you want to or don't. I'll always be Grandma, and you'll always be my grandchild. No one gets to use that bond to scare you." Silence, then a little sigh of relief. "I understand, Grandma. Go study. If you want this weekend, I'll take you to the New York Public Library. The picture reading room is beautiful." "Yes." Her voice suddenly brightened. I texted Owen a short line. "Don't worry about Grandma. Study well, play ball safely. I can take care of myself." He sent back a basketball and a heart simple, more honest than any letter. That night I opened my brown leather journal and started a meticulous log. Time, place, what was said, who said what, in what tone, which bouquet arrived, what the card said. I even copied Marjorie's text verbatim. I taped the flower delivery receipt to the page with clear tape. Each page a puzzle piece, building a rebuttal file I could carry into any hearing. I printed an 8-year summary, total transfers, real check-ins, number of money requests, all numbered, dated, matched with statements. I added notes on the birthdays they forgot not to play the victim, but to contextualize behavior. I stacked everything into a red envelope, the color I use for documents no one gets to pretend they didn't see. The next morning I called Adrian. "Next Friday night I want dinner with the whole family. No occasion, just family dinner." He hesitated. "Mom, we'd love that. At the Westport house?" "Good. And I have a few things to say after dessert. Please invite 2 of my friends. They're older, kind. Seat them at the end of the table." "Which friends?" "The ones you met at your father's funeral. Jacob Stein, retired from Wexler, and Dr. Naomi Chu, a family therapist. They're coming for dinner, just dinner." I heard him swallow. "Okay, I'll arrange it." I hung up. The independent third parties weren't to threaten anyone. Their presence alone would be enough as silent witnesses for a night that needed clarity. While waiting for Dr. Khan's appointment, my phone kept buzzing. Apologies soft as velvet, tidy check-ins, offers to take you to the park, to lunch. I picked the gentlest invitations to keep the 30-day rhythm enough to lengthen the rope, enough to thicken the mask. Each night I checked the chip under the table, exported files, and labeled them by date and content. Tessa Flowers card. Adrian apology dinner. I didn't replay them to torture myself. I saved them to spare future arguments. As Americans say, if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. For me, if it isn't recorded, it will be retold differently. On the day, I arrived at Dr. Lila Khan's clinic. Bright waiting room, the faint smell of freshly sharpened pencils. She appeared with a neat silver cut and clear, kind eyes. The evaluation ran for hours. Digit spans, block designs, rule switching, reading comprehension interpretation. Midway, she offered tea. "Are you stressed, Estelle?" "I feel oddly calm," I said honestly. "Maybe because for the first time, I don't need to prove I'm a good mother. I just need to prove I'm lucid." She smiled and finished the last task. I left with a pickup date for results, the center's blue stamp shining. On the sidewalk, the sky felt like an open door. No rumor could declare me unstable anymore. In the afternoon, I stopped by the small church on Madison, sat in the back, and didn't ask for anything grand. I just told Grant in my heart, I'm doing the right thing. When I stepped out, sunlight shattered across the red brick, quiet, proud. That evening, I called Marjorie and described the dinner plan. She chuckled. "I'll wear the wine-colored coat. Need me to say anything?" "I just need you to sit, breathe, and watch. Sometimes that's enough." In the days that followed, I finalized a timeline. Who called when, whether I answered, the main point of each exchange. I printed 3 copies, one for me, one for Harold, one sealed in the safe. The night before dinner, I stood in my kitchen and looked around. The home was quiet but not sad. White porcelain cups, fresh flowers, the table runner Grant loved. I placed 2 things in my handbag. Dr. Khan's evaluation signed and stamped, and my 8-year summary. Not to flaunt, just so that if anyone chose to forget, the papers would remember for me. I rested my hand on the bag and felt my heartbeat steady. Strangely, I wasn't nervous. Tomorrow night wasn't a trial or a stage. It was just family dinner. But I knew that at that dinner, the truth would sit in the center of the table like a main course no one could ignore. I turned off the stove and drew the curtains. Outside, New York roared. Inside, I touched the pearls at my neck and heard Grant's voice like a breeze. "Don't let money buy silence, Estelle." I smiled. Not this time. Because tomorrow, I would 5. Speak with documents, with numbers, with the calmest voice I have. And when all the rumors fall away, only one thing will stand. I know who I am. 3 days after I received Dr. Lila Khan's evaluation, Harold called back, "I know someone you can trust. No flash, tight as a locked lake. Name's Quinn Park Private Investigator. He helped Grant in that Manhattan asset dispute back in 2011. I remembered that case. Grant once said, Quinn has the brain of an accountant and the instincts of a cop." I nodded, though Harold couldn't see me. "Give him my number." 2 days later, right at 9 a.m., the doorbell rang. A man in his mid-40s, tall, lean, charcoal coat spoke in a low, even voice. He showed his license, then said, "Mrs. Estelle, I know this needs to be quiet. No one besides you and Mr. Benton should know I exist." I nodded and poured black coffee. "What do you need from me, Mr. Park?" "Only 3 things. Old statements, transaction, emails with the bank, and temporary access to the trust account. I'll find the rest." I set a thick envelope on the table, everything ready. I want to know where the money I sent Adrian went. Every dollar. "And if there are outsiders involved, I want names." Quinn's mouth twitched. A cool light flashed behind his glasses. "I'll dig. But prepare yourself when money's involved. People rarely stop at ungrateful." 7 days later, he came back. The Park Avenue kitchen was bright with early spring light, but when Quinn opened his laptop, the gray-blue screen glinted colder than any metal. "Here's their financial picture, Mrs. Estelle." First line, 7 credit cards, total balance, $148,000. Next, a second mortgage on the Westport house, $320,000. And a string of late payments from the kids' private school. I stayed quiet, staring at the numbers like a house whose walls were slowly cracking. "Worse," Quinn said. "They set up an intermediary account, call it a buffer account. It's registered to Tessa, but the primary recipient is Adrian." He zoomed in on a cash flow chart. Each month, the transfers I made to the family trust were split 80% to the main account, 20% to the buffer account. From there, the money cycled, paying down a slice of debt, then moving back, creating the illusion of a clean, transparent flow. "A soft way to launder movement," Quinn said. "Perfectly legal on paper and convincing enough to make outsiders think every expense is on the level." I leaned back, a chill running along my spine. How long have they been doing this? At least 2.5 years. I also found their private sessions with a separate financial advisor, named Merrill Stone, Family Asset Management. Meetings are scheduled on Tuesdays, often right after your monthly transfers. Quinn took a sip of coffee, then spoke slowly, like reciting a confession for someone else. "Then comes the worst part." He opened another folder labeled Social Witnesses. "They're building a social file on you. Neighbors saying, 'You forget things', club staff claiming you talk to yourself in the locker room, a yoga coach saying you lose focus during meditation. All logged with email confirmations between Tessa and an attorney named Robert Kane." My breathing grew heavy, not from shock, but from realizing every tiny quirk and petty rumor had been weaponized on purpose. "They need social proof to bolster a guardianship case," Quinn explained. "On paper, they're dutiful children caring for a mother who's slipping out of control." I asked, my voice rough. "Since when did they start thinking about this?" Quinn rotated the screen, extracted emails with a timeline. "Right after Mr. Grant's funeral, I have a memo from Kane to Adrian. The emotional period following loss is an appropriate time to initiate a soft guardianship plan." Those 4 words, soft guardianship plan, made me want to laugh. Polished language for legalized theft. Quinn went on. "I also found a parallel legal advice schedule with Merrill. They discussed getting familiar with the local judge and building goodwill with the Westport community. For 5 years, they've been stockpiling good witnesses by donating to the school fund, attending galas, and telling the story of a mother-in-law unbalanced by loneliness." I was silent for a long time. Outside, a siren wailed and thinned into the air. "And you're certain this data is accurate?" "I have copies of emails, appointments, transfer statements, even Kane's internal notes I recovered from an archive account. Everything is encrypted and backed up to a separate drive." I nodded slightly. "Good. Print 2 sets. One for you, one for me." Quinn looked at me a bit surprised. "You don't want me to keep monitoring?" "No need. I don't need more proof to understand people. I just need enough to lay on the table when they say, 'for Mom's sake.'" That afternoon, I sat in my study printing everything. The steady whir of the printer sounded like someone's heartbeat counting down. I organized it all. Cash flow charts. List of buffer accounts. Emails about guardianship. Attorney Kane's transaction logs. Notes from Merrill Stone. I clipped each set, labeled them in red, and slid them into a red envelope the color Grant always said was only for truths no one can deny. I sealed it and placed it in the safe beside Dr. Lila Khan's report. Dr. Khan did not disappoint. In the cover letter, she'd added a handwritten line, "No signs of cognitive decline. Mrs. Estelle is fully lucid. Reasoning, memory, and emotional regulation are strong. Any contrary claims lack medical basis." I read that line again, and Again, not to reassure myself, but because it sounded like music that finally loosened a knot. Those 10 lines weighed more than all the money Adrian and Tessa ever demanded. I leaned back. Late sun striped through the blinds onto the pearls at my throat, flashing like Grant's reminder, "Don't let anyone retell your story the way they want." Quinn called again that evening. Voice even, "Mrs. Estelle, I'm sending the backup on an encrypted drive. Password is your and Mr. Grant's wedding date. I'll keep a second backup in secure storage. Only you or Mr. Benton can access it." "Thank you, Quinn. What do you plan to do next?" I looked out the window at New York, glittering like a sea of indifferent lights. "Nothing yet," I said slowly. "Only when they believe I've bitten the bait does the final move really land." He paused, then spoke softly. "Mrs. Estelle, you're not just lucid, you're formidable." I smiled. "Don't worry, I'm not chasing victory. I'm reclaiming fairness, the thing they forgot how to define." That night, I reopened the opening act folder and added a new one, Hidden Flows Financial Evidence. 2 folders, 2 stories. One about feelings, one about figures. Together they formed the full portrait of betrayal by people I used to call family. I closed the laptop and switched off the light. Street glow poured through the window, falling on the red envelope on my desk, its shadow on the wall like a seal over a secret now complete. I touched it lightly, a thin smile rising. Now I have enough ammunition. No shouting, no noisy revenge, just one evening and one line at the right moment, and everything will cave in. Day 29. A damp, pale New York morning. I was making tea when the phone rang. Adrian's name. I hesitated a few seconds, then answered. "Mom," his voice caught. "I'm sorry. I've thought a lot these past weeks. You're right, we were wrong." I said nothing. I could hear shaky breathing. Then Tessa's voice, strangely soft. "Mom, I know I've been disrespectful. I was afraid you'd be sad, so I acted foolishly. I want to start over, truly, Mom. If I hadn't had recordings and an investigation file, I might have cried. But now every word of that apology sounded like lines read smooth at a final rehearsal." I only said, "Thank you both. This Friday I want to meet the whole family. Dinner, Westport." A brief pause, then Adrian rushed in. "Of course, Mom. We'll make it happen." I set the phone down and sipped my tea. The orange blossom was still sweet, but it couldn't mask the cold steel spreading in my chest. The board was set. All that remained was the last move. That afternoon, I video called Maya and Owen. They were in the study room, shelves behind them stacked with picture books and little science models. I smiled, voice easy, like nothing big was coming. "I'm coming for dinner this weekend. But I want to tell you both something. No matter what happens, remember Grandma loves you unconditionally. The grown-up stuff I'll handle. You just keep studying and being kind. Deal?" Owen nodded. Maya asked softly, "Will you be okay, Grandma?" "I used to be fragile," I said, "but not anymore. Just remember, kindness isn't the same as silence." I ended the call feeling lighter. Kids shouldn't watch a battlefield, but I want them to know the truth is never something to be ashamed of. That evening, I called Harold Benton. "Friday, 7 p.m. I need you on standby. If I signal, FaceTime in and confirm live legal witnessing." "Understood, Estelle. I'll have the Westport deed and the trust documents ready. Everything is in your name. Good. Test the connection beforehand." I hung up and looked at the red envelope on the table. Inside, along with Quinn Park's report, were copies of Dr. Lila Khan's evaluation and the timeline I built. Transfer dates. Dates they called. Dates the unstable mother rumor spread, and the first day they mentioned guardianship. All arranged like a score of betrayal. One I, and no one else, would play for them. The last 2 days I was busier than I'd been in years. Not planning payback, but putting my life back in order. I went to Harold's office and signed the new will. "Are you sure, Estelle?" he asked, voice low. "Very sure," I said, crisp. "The entire estate house, stocks, investment funds, savings, totaling roughly $50 million, will go to the Grant Estelle Foundation for scholarships and community health. My husband's name will live there with mine, not in the hearts of people who see him as a checkbook." Harold nodded, eyes a little wet. "He'd be proud of you." I smiled. "I'm not doing it to make him proud. I'm doing it so I can be at peace." Day 30, Friday morning. I rose early, took the red envelope out of the safe, and slipped it into my small handbag. Before leaving, I opened the kitchen drawer and checked the mini recorder hidden under the liner. The light blinked green. Full battery. I called my locksmith on Madison. "Can we schedule tomorrow morning? Replace all locks at the Westport house. Front, back, garage." "I'll be there for paperwork." "Yes, 8 a.m., ma'am." I hung up, feeling strangely light. No matter how dinner went, tomorrow I'd have the keys. At lunch, I stopped by a small spot on Lexington for the onion soup Grant loved. In the back booth, I flipped through the copies again. Westport title held by the Grant Estelle Family Trust. Trustee, Estelle K. Grant. Temporary eviction packet already signed, one confirmation away. Attorney Kane's email to Tessa using the line, "Once the mother-in-law is deemed incapacitated, the trust assets can be redistributed." I snapped a photo of that printout and sent it to Harold with a note. "This is the line they didn't manage to delete." Harold replied, short and calm, "Stay steady. You hold every legal advantage. They can't touch a single brick." I put my phone away and looked up. The sun had come out. Light bounced off the metal tabletop, and I remembered what Grant used to say. "Sometimes the win isn't in striking back. It's in being prepared so thoroughly you can't be knocked down." I smiled. He'd like how I'm playing this one. In the afternoon, I called my two older friends, Jacob Stein and Naomi Chu. Jacob's a retired attorney who knows guardianship law inside out. Naomi's a therapist who's seen too many cases of family abuse. "I need you both at dinner in Westport tonight," I said. "You don't have to speak, just sit at the end of the table. Observe. If you see me look over and nod, Jacob, you'll FaceTime Harold. Naomi, you'll note demeanor and conduct as an informal social assessment. I need witnesses." Jacob was thoughtful. "Estelle, are you sure? This won't stay a small family matter." "I'm sure. They turned my name into gossip. I'll turn the truth into a verdict." Naomi smiled over the phone, voice soft as air. "You don't need to shout, Estelle. Truth has its own volume." I spent the rest of the afternoon writing a short note, not a will, just a last page to myself. If anyone asks why I didn't forgive, I'll say this. Forgiveness isn't erasing the offense, it's ending the offender's control. I don't need my son punished. I need him to see the cost of greed. I folded the note, tucked it into my journal, and closed it. At sunset, I put on my navy coat and the pearls Grant gave me and looked in the mirror. No tears. Just a 67-year-old woman walking into the final match of her life with the calm that only experience and pain can forge. Before I left, I checked my bag. Recorder. New will. Evidence timeline. Quinn Parks Lug. Investigative file. Dr. Lila Khan's report. And my phone with FaceTime set to Harold Benton at the top. I inhaled, turned off the lights, and locked the door. Outside, New York was lighting up. Cars glittered, crowds hurried by. No one knew that in a suburb an hour away, a family dinner would become a mother's quiet presentation of justice. I stepped out and called a car. Streetlights washed over my face in the rearview mirror, reflecting my steady eyes. No anger, no tears, only purposeful quiet, the quiet of someone holding the final move. I reached Westport half an hour early. The two-story house they'd bought mostly with my money now looked like a spread in a design magazine. Crystal chandelier, starched white linens, a vase of Dutch tulips centered on the dining table. They'd prepared well not to welcome a mother, but to stage a perfect family reunion. Tessa met me at the door, a trace of expensive perfume. She tilted her head, a thin smile, syrupy voice. "You're early, Mom. I wanted to surprise you." I answered lightly. "At my age, I'm done with surprises." I prefer the truth. The housekeeper, the only truly neutral person there, hung my coat quickly. On the table, candles burned. The dishes were the fine china saved for special occasions. I sat, feeling the room glow like a set. Adrian came out of the kitchen with a tray of wine, trying to seem natural. "Red for you, Mom? I remember you like Bordeaux." I smiled faintly. "Right. Grant always bought it for our anniversaries." Tessa jumped in to keep the scene moving. "I remember you said this black dress makes you look more elegant than anything else." "I'm so glad you wore it tonight." I looked at her and smoothed the fabric. It was the dress I wore to Grant's funeral. "Yes, it sent your father off. I'm wearing it again to send off another part of my life." The table stilled. I sipped. The tannins grazed my tongue, bitter, clarifying. The main course passed under a pretend, cheerful hush. Weather talk, the neighborhood, any travel plans, Mom? Each question arranged like a choir. After dessert lemon cake with frosting, the kind Tessa knows I like, I set down my fork, dabbed my mouth, and stood. Candlelight slid over the black dress, glinting off the table. "Now," I said, each word clear, "it's my turn." Tessa smiled tight. "Oh, a speech? Wonderful, everyone." I raised a hand and cut in. "I won't be long, but I want you to hear me out." I placed a red envelope in the middle of the table. Tessa blinked. Adrian frowned. "This," I said, "is the cognitive and capacity evaluation from Dr. Lila Khan, a specialist recognized by federal courts. Conclusion: Mrs. Estelle is fully lucid, with complete capacity to manage finances and make legal decisions." No one spoke. I continued, "And this," I set down another stack, "is the buffer account statements, guardianship planning schedule, and the list of people you contacted to build social witnesses." I spoke slowly, evenly, without raising my voice. They all signed, and each believed they were helping a family care for a mother losing control. I've heard every call, read every email. "I know you started this right after Grant's funeral." Adrian sprang up. "Mom, I don't understand what you're talking about." I met his eyes. "You do. Because you discussed a soft guardianship plan with Attorney Kane. And Tessa, you emailed advisor Meryl Stone about preparing a lawful guardianship approach when Mom shows instability. I have the originals." Tessa went pale, voice shaking. Who made this up?" "This is a misunderstanding. We were only trying to protect you." I pulled out my phone and hit speaker. Harold Benton's voice came through, clear and cool. "This is Harold Benton, counsel to Mrs. Estelle Grant. Under Connecticut law, any deliberate fabrication of evidence to secure control over the assets of a competent adult constitutes legal fraud. Additionally, using an elderly person's assets without authorization is financial elder abuse, subject to criminal prosecution." Tessa went pale, lips pressed tight. Adrian stood frozen. I gently set the phone down. "Thank you, Harold. I'll call you back." Then I turned to them, my voice calm. "If you still think this is a misunderstanding, listen to this." I took a small recorder from my handbag and pressed play. Adrian's voice rang out clear, echoing through the quiet dining room. "Just sign it. Mom won't understand. If we wait, she might change her mind. Doing it on her birthday makes the most sense. She'll be soft." Then Tessa's voice, "Don't forget the trust if we don't get control of those assets soon. It'll be too late." A soft gasp came from the head of the table. "Maya." She set her spoon down, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Dad, Mom, why?" Owen's face went rigid as he stared at his parents like they were strangers. I stopped the recorder and looked down at the two of them. Kids, the grown-up stuff isn't yours to carry. I know none of this is your fault. Remember, real love never needs to be hidden. I squeezed Maya's hand, then turned back to Adrian and Tessa. My voice stayed even, no shaking, no anger. In front of my grandchildren, I won't lower myself by yelling. But I do have a duty to spell out the consequences. I took out another thin file and set it on the table. These are the legal papers for the Westport house. The entire property belongs to the Grant Estelle Family Trust. I'm the trustee. You are guests, nothing more. The eviction packet is signed. The lawful move-out deadline is 14 days. Adrian stepped back, face drained. You can't do this. This is my house. No, I said softly. This is the house of the woman you used to call. Mom, the one who paid for everything, from your wedding to your children's tuition. Starting today, that mother stops being a bank. Tessa broke down, sobbing, trying to grab my hand. Mom, I'm sorry. I was scared of losing everything. I didn't know it would go this far. I pulled my hand back and looked at her. Not angry anymore, just tired. Tessa, if you were truly afraid of losing, you should have learned how to keep. But you didn't keep trust, and that's the one thing money can't buy back. The room fell dead silent. Only the small crackle of candle wicks and the wall clock counting seconds remained. I glanced at Jacob and Naomi, my two friends at the end of the table. They said nothing, just gave the slightest nod. I knew everything had been recorded, in full. I gathered the documents and put them in my bag. Before standing, I looked around the table and softened my voice. I don't need you to be punished. I need you to understand that. Every action has a price. If you want to start over, live on your own 2 feet. If you choose the old path, then the law will teach you the rest. I paused, letting my eyes rest on Maya and Owen once more. You two, Grandma will still be here if one day you need a place to come home to. Just not today. Then I turned and walked away without looking back. Outside, the Westport night air tasted faintly of salt. I stepped out feeling like I had closed a long chapter. Behind me, I heard Tessa's sobs and Adrian calling out, "Mom, please!" But I didn't stop. Moonlight spilled across the stone path, throwing a long, steady shadow of me. I knew they would never forget the image of the woman in a black dress walking out of the house that had been their symbol, red envelope in hand, head held high. And I knew that from that moment, I'd taken back my name, Estelle Grant. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. New York was cold and dry. Winter lights slanted through the crater. Blinds. I made tea, opened the window, and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a void. It felt like space to be free. I'd spent the night writing the final lines in the packet for Harold not to hurt Adrian and Tessa, but to close a phase I'd enabled for too long. That afternoon, I drove back to Westport alone. The gates stood open. No laughter, no perfume like the night before, just silence heavy and hollow. Adrian and Tessa sat on the sofa, faces drawn. I didn't circle around it. I'm here to make things clear. I set the file on the table, my voice steady, not shaking. Under the trust terms, you have 30 days to vacate the Westport house. This isn't punishment. It's putting everyone back in the right place. This home belongs to the Grant Estelle Family Trust, created to serve community funds and medical research, not something for anyone to cling to. Adrian lowered his head, hands clenched. Mom, we know we fought. We're wrong. But the kids, their school. I nodded slightly. I've accounted for that. I'll support Maya and Owen's tuition paid directly to the school. Not through the parents. Their education won't be disrupted. But that's for them, not for you. Tessa looked up, eyes red. Are you throwing our whole family out? We have nowhere else. No, I said, still gentle but firm. I'm not throwing you out. I'm giving you 30 days to stand on your own feet. I pulled 2 envelopes from my bag. These are career counselors Harold arranged. One specializes in re-entry for women who've been out of the workforce, Tessa. Contact her. And this is a list of open project management roles around Stamford that fit Adrian's background. You can both start over if you're willing to relearn how to work. Tessa's voice shook. You don't understand, we were just trying to help you, so you wouldn't be tricked by others. I gave a fawn. Small, wry smile, no bitterness, only the sour truth. Help? By pushing guardianship papers? By hiring people to spin a story that I'm out of control? Listen, help is a right to give, not a tribute you're entitled to collect. I've let you forget that for too long. The room sank back into silence. Only the clock ticked, as if measuring out the beats of my patience. I opened another file and set it down. This is my new will. I'm saying it now to avoid any misunderstanding later. The entire estate house, stocks, savings, investment funds, totaling $50 million will go to education, healthcare, and scholarship funds under the Grant Foundation. Your father's legacy and mine will serve those who truly need help, not those planning to take it. Adrian lifted his head, eyes shining. Mom, you're not leaving anything to me? I looked at my son, the baby I held when he was only hours old, the boy I soothed in the dark, the man whose early debts I paid, and said quietly, I'm leaving you more than money. I'm leaving you the chance to start over. If you use it, that's the greatest inheritance I can give. Tears rolled down Adrian's face, but I knew it wasn't just loss, it was the first time in his life he'd be responsible for himself. I turned to the study table where Maya and Owen sat silent. They didn't speak, but I saw fear in their eyes, the kind kids feel when they realize adults aren't perfect. I went over and sat at their level. Kids, Grandma has a little gift just for you. I took out 2 small envelopes. Inside are a letter from me, city library cards, and a list of free community activities, places I'd like you to try this summer. You'll meet people who teach by doing, not by talking. Maya looked at me and whispered, Grandma, you won't be mad at my mom and dad, right? No, I'm not mad. But I won't hide the truth anymore. Adults have to relearn how to live. Right, and you just keep learning to be kind. I hugged them both lightly, felt their quick breaths against my shoulder. Then I stood and faced Adrian. Son, hear me one last time. You can lose my money, but don't lose being a father. The kids need a guide, not an excuse maker. They don't need wealth, they need example. Start there. Adrian bowed his head, hands over his face. Tessa sat in silence. I looked around the room one last time. Everything was in place, the beige sofa, the wedding photo, the slightly crooked oil painting, but the warmth of family was gone. I'll have someone inspect the house after you move out. Don't worry, I'm not taking back anything except the truth. Tessa burst into tears, her sobs cracking the air. Mom, do you think you could ever forgive me? I answered slowly, without dodging it. Forgiveness, Tessa, doesn't mean going back. Forgiveness is when I no longer let pain run my life. If you truly regret, show it with actions. She nodded and covered her face. Adrian stared out the window at the bare winter maples. I walked to the door. The cold air bit my skin, but I could breathe. Before leaving, I turned back. Harold will reach out to guide you through the move-out process. And don't think about lawsuits or spreading rumors every piece of evidence is saved. With one call, I'll file criminal charges. No one answered. I knew they understood. I stepped down the porch. Thin sunlight hit the pavers. The breeze carried a far-off salt smell. I got in the car but didn't start it yet. I looked in the rearview mirror. The door closed behind me, quiet. Inside, they were probably crying, falling apart, but to me, it wasn't the sound of pain anymore. It was the sound of illusions cracking. Merging onto the highway, I saw the sign, New York 60 miles. I let out a small laugh. 60 miles, but the distance between a mother once exploited and a woman now free. I touched the pearls Grant gave me and whispered, Do you see, love? I finally did it. No hatred, no selling my soul, just letting go at the right time. Headlights ahead strung together like stars. Peace settled in my chest. No more begging calls, no more demanding texts, no more staged family dinners, just a little jazz and an open road. From now on, if anyone asks, "Mrs. Estelle, do you have regrets?" I'll smile and say, "No. I only regret not doing this sooner." I lowered the window and let the wind wash over my face, clean and bright. Behind me, Westport faded into dusk. Ahead, the city lit up, and I, Estelle Grant, was truly free for the first time in years. A week after the dessert night, Westport felt like someone had flipped a switch to quiet. But at the country club, the wood-floored corridor still buzzed. I didn't go. I only needed Marjorie. She called me Tuesday afternoon, gleeful like she'd just watched a final curtain drop. "Estelle, you didn't have to do a thing." Dr. Khan's evaluation accidentally landed in the club's shared inbox official copy, seal, and wet signature. Anyone who whispered unstable got shut down on the spot. They changed the topic faster than swapping tennis shoes. I laughed, not a victory laugh, a relieved one. When the truth comes with documents, it walks itself where it needs to go. I just said, "Thank you, Marjorie," and poured more tea. Late sunlight slipped through the blinds, painting pale gold rectangles on the wall. That evening, I signed a stack of letters Harold drafted to the social witnesses, the yoga coach, the event coordinator, a few gym acquaintances. Each letter was polite and direct, reminding them that repeating false claims about someone's mental capacity can be defamation. That adding a line at someone's urging to support a fraudulent guardianship could be aiding and abetting. No insults, no heat, just statute names, section numbers, and Harold Benton's firm signature. Thursday morning, Harold called. "Eviction complete." The locksmith changed the locks at 7:30 a.m. The inventory log is signed by witnesses. Adrian and Tessa's belongings are sealed and moved to storage for a month per regulations. You don't need to appear. I stood at the window, watching a thin cloud cut across the sky. Strange how, when the boundary is clear, your mind feels rinsed clean. That night, I opened the first transfer files for the Estelle and Grant Foundation, seed money, and a 10-year funding plan for 3 tracks: secondary and college scholarships, community clinics, and programs to prevent financial abuse of the elderly. I signed with a steady hand even I didn't expect. Grant used to say, "Money is like water. Either you let it stagnate or you channel it where people need the cool." I chose the latter. The next day, I stopped by Dr. Lila Khan's clinic just to say thank you even though I knew she was busy. The waiting room still smelled faintly of freshly sharpened pencils. Dr. Khan shook my hand, eyes sharp yet kind. "I only did my job, Mrs. Estelle." "You did more," I said. "You handed me a mirror to see myself clearly." She smiled. "Boundaries are vitamins for a late-blooming mind. Once you set them, your brain stops burning energy on fear and uses it for clarity." I carried that line home like a mint under my tongue. Cool, clean, steady. The last piece was Maya and Owen. I wouldn't let them become couriers for adult emotion. I booked a schedule with family therapist Dr. Naomi Chu, fixed calls every Sunday at 5 p.m., routed through her office. There, every conversation would be neutrally noted, no interruptions, no one standing behind to coach lines. I texted Maya, "Sunday, 5 p.m., I'll be there." She sent a smiley, then a drawing, a paper boat floating on blue marker water, the word Grandma on the sail. Owen sent 3 basketballs and Baforty. "Okay." I laughed. Kids somehow say exactly what's needed without many words. Then came the cleaning not of the house, but of my circle. I made one small rule. If a distant relative text starts with, "This is small," or "Aunt Estelle, I'm short for a few days," I don't reply right away. I let 24 hours pass. If it still feels like a demand rather than sharing, I don't reply at all. I call it cutting out convenient toxins. The things that wear you down aren't the punches, they're the daily pats on the shoulder asking you to give a little, then a little more. Each night, I wrote a gratitude log. 3 things, nothing grand. A cup of tea brewed just right, a cool breeze through the small window, a stranger holding the elevator door. After 10 nights, I realized the wound wasn't seeping anymore. It had skinned over not because I forgot, but because I put it in the right box. On the weekend, I opened Grant's closet. The familiar masculine scent had faded, leaving touchable memories. Wool lapels, silver cufflinks, the wine-colored silk scarf he only wore at Christmas. I kept a few things: the watch with a scuffed bezel, a crinkled jazz ticket in a coat pocket. The rest I had appraised for auction, with every dollar earmarked for the foundation. People call it giving away. To me, it was letting those things continue their journey. Sunday evening, I stood in the kitchen. No pots clattering for a family dinner like before. The kitchen was quiet, and I smiled, quiet but not lonely. Loneliness is being abandoned in a crowd. Now I stood alone and felt close to myself. The club gossip died like a flame splashed with water. Once instability was replaced by a clean bill of mental health, everyone pivoted to weather, Court 3's turf, and the upcoming ball. People are like that. If the topic no longer lets them feel right by gossiping, they move on. Marjorie said, "Let them. We live." I nodded. We live. Harold sent a long procedural summary. Locks changed, belongings sealed by the book, third-party storage receipt signed, a no trespass notice to Adrian and Tessa, plus clauses for complaint mediation arbitration tight as a net. I read it through and filed it in the top drawer, the one I only opened to remind myself that today's piece was built on clear lines. At the first Sunday call, Maya showed up first, Naomi's office in the background. She talked about an essay on a quiet hero, hesitated, then asked, "Grandma, do quiet heroes always forgive?" I thought a few seconds. No, quiet heroes set limits. Forgiveness means not letting hate burn you up. Limits mean not letting anyone burn you again. Maya nodded and smiled. Owen popped in late, held up his basketball, and bragged about free throws. "Good," I said. "If you keep discipline on the court, you'll keep it off the court." Naomi smiled in the corner and jotted notes. She was helping me build a small bridge across the age gap so the kids could cross without stepping into adult mud. Another night, a text from an unknown number. "Miss Estelle, I'm a cousin on your mother's side. I heard that you—" I looked at it and put the phone down. 24-hour rule. The next morning, I deleted it, not out of harshness, but because I've learned any tiny gap becomes a path for others' needs to seep in and erode your own. I swapped out the yellowed curtains and the too-dim bulb in the kitchen corner. I bought a few blue hydrangeas and set them in the Savannah porcelain vase Grant once brought home. I put on old jazz Ella Fitzgerald singing Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, her voice like silk through the room. The kitchen was still quiet, but now it was warm, because it was mine, not someone's stage. On the weekend, Marjorie and I walked the park. The wind flipped leaves. The sky looked like a white sheet hung in the sun. She teased, "Do you think people are afraid of you now?" I said. "I hope it's respect instead. Fear fades fast. Respect, if built from clear boundaries and conditional kindness, lasts like paving stones." On the way back, I stopped at a used bookstore and bought a new leather journal. I had 4 words embossed on the cover: boundaries and gratitude. Each day I'd write 2 columns, what I said no to and what I said thank you for. 2 simple rails for the train of my heart to run straight. Night fell. I dimmed the lights, leaving a warm pool on the table. I set Grant's photo in the center, his head tipped in a sun-crinkled smile. I poured a little red wine and lifted my glass to the air. "Grant, hear me?" The rumor's gone. The boundaries are bright. I'm no longer the good mom who wears herself down. I'm Estelle, the woman who knows what to keep and what to release. Outside, the city hummed, but in this kitchen, the quiet wasn't a pit, it was a lake, smooth, deep, reflecting my face as it is, not warped by the need to be loved at any cost. I set the glass down, pulled out the journal, and wrote, "Today I said no to a roundabout money text. Today I said thank you for a 30-minute call with Maya's real laughter, and thank you for a quiet kitchen, quiet but not lonely." I closed the book. A chapter ended without fireworks. Just a line drawn bold and straight, one no one gets to erase with tears. I turned off the lights. In the soft dark, I heard my heart tapping a normal beat like any heart no longer bewildered. And I knew, from here on, I'm living the rest of my life on ground that is mine. The following spring, I got a short text from Adrian. "Mom, may I see you?" Alone. No fancy restaurant, no glossy cafe like before, just a small shop in Brooklyn where I used to take him for sandwiches when he was little. I arrived on time. Adrian was already seated, no suit, no tie, no luxury car at the curb. Just a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, eyes direct and tired. "I'm not here to talk about money, Mom," he began, voice hoarse like someone just out of a storm. "I just want to talk." I nodded. "Then talk." He went quiet for a few seconds, then exhaled. "I've spent my whole life protecting that all-set image. I was scared of losing the house, scared of losing status, scared my friends would find out I wasn't the Grant heir anymore. But when everything collapsed, I saw I didn't really keep anything. I let Tessa lead, and I was weak. I don't know how to be a father anymore, Mom." I looked at my son, the man who once thought he was the strongest in the family, now speaking honestly, without a shell. No excuses, no blame, just bare responsibility. I said gently, "If you want to start over, I'll listen, but you know this help isn't unconditional anymore. I have 3 conditions." He nodded. "First," I said, "you need stable work for at least 6 months, no borrowing, no asking for help. Second, both of you must attend family counseling with an independent professional, and you don't get to quit halfway. And third, you owe a public apology, not just to me, but to everyone you let those rumors hurt." Adrian lowered his head, eyes wet. "I agree. Can you trust me this time?" "I don't need to trust," I said. "I just need you to do." 2 weeks later, an email from Tessa landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple: apology. The letter was long, more than 1,000 words. Apologies line by line, explanations about pressure, fear, pride. I read it all, neither angry nor moved. I replied in 4 lines. "Tessa, thank you for writing. I don't need words, I need actions. Get real work. Stop posting borrowed images of a life, and let the kids see their parents no longer hiding behind gloss. When that happens, I'll know you're changing." 3 days later, Harold sent confirmation that tuition had been paid for a client relations and event organization course at Norwalk Community College. The payer was me, but the recipient was the school. I wasn't handing Tessa cash. I was investing in a real chance. Adrian started at a mid-sized project management firm, making about 1/10 of his old income, but enough to live on. And Tessa, once only used to high heels, learned to stand 8 hours in a conference hall, handle clients, and reset rows of chairs. I didn't interfere. I watched quietly from a distance through brief texts to Maya. "Your dad's home late, learning to cook. Your mom's turning an early class in the morning." I understood. Making amends doesn't need a stage, just a small kitchen and a pot of soup simmering. In the summer, Adrian moved no more Westport Mansion, but a small rental apartment near the kids' school. I helped not with my hands, but with a nod of approval. 2 bedrooms, low ceilings, a balcony facing the train tracks but clean and bright. Tessa hung pale green curtains. Maya set a little vase of flowers. You know, I told Adrian, small homes often hold the big conversations. He smiled genuinely, for the first time. In September, I received a printed photo in a white envelope. No signature, no note, just Maya in a blue dress holding a violin on the school grounds, and Owen mid-free throw, mouth wide in a grin. On the back, someone had written in pencil, "Ordinary life can be far more beautiful." I keep the photo in a silver frame on my desk. Every morning when I make tea, I look at it a reminder that ordinary doesn't mean less, it means right-sized. 6 months later, I called Harold. I want to set up a small scholarship in the kids' names, the Maya and Owen Grant Scholarship. Each year, it will award students with strong attendance and at least 20 hours of community service. Harold asked, "Any conditions for the children's parents?" I smiled. "No, they already have their own condition, to watch their kids grow up in a healthy environment. That's a reward bigger than any check." That night, I opened my gratitude journal. First entry: I'm grateful my son learned how to apologize without excuses. Second: grateful Tessa stopped putting makeup on her fear. Third: grateful I kept my word, no return to a living stipend, only support for education and therapy. I call it helping without binding. In November, I attended Maya's school concert. I sat in the back row. Nobody noticed me. When the piece ended, she bowed and her eyes met mine for a split second. That look, it wasn't a child trapped in an adult war. It was a spirit free to love both sides without choosing. After the concert, Adrian came over, not much talk. Just, "I've done the 6 months. Work steady, counseling regular, no debt. Mom, are you proud of me yet?" I touched his shoulder. "No need to be proud. I just feel at peace." He smiled slightly. "Me too." Tessa stood a few steps away, not intruding, but her eyes no longer had the old calculating sheen. They were gentle, tired, and real. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is be tired at the right time so they finally stop. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and opened the window. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling. I thought about the path from that cold chocolate mousse on my 67th birthday to tonight, when I know love can return if it's taught to stand up straight. I remembered Dr. Khan's line from our last visit: "Some children aren't bad, they've just never been loved the right way, and sometimes loving them right means stopping the funding." I get it now. Boundaries, kept long enough, turn into a way of life, and from that way of life, respect sprouts. That night, I wrote in my journal, "Today I said no to pity. Today I said thank you for life patiently," reteaching my son. Today I learned that boundaries, when sown with love, still bloom into flowers. I closed the book and turned off the light, the glow catching the frame of Maya and Owen. I thought that maybe making amends isn't about begging forgiveness, it's about living decently long enough for someone to believe you really understand. And in that moment I smiled, knowing every final exam once passed becomes a new beginning. A year later, my kitchen smelled like orange blossom tea again. I tied on an old apron, opened the oven, and carefully slid in a tray of chocolate mousse cake. Same cake as that year, but this time, not for anyone else, for me. Warmth spilled out, mixing with the soft March wind tapping the window. Chocolate drifted through the room, sweet but not sharp, like my heart now, no longer boiling, just warm. The Estelle and Grant Foundation entered its first year of operation. The first round of scholarships went to 10 students in medicine and community education, and we opened the first clinic Grant Community Health Center in Brooklyn. I didn't cut a ribbon. I stood back in the crowd, looking at Grant's name etched in bright steel. Something in me felt both heavy and light, as if, at last, our life had paid back its finest debt to the world. I didn't expect Adrian to show up. He stood in the back, alone, no suit, no forced smile. When people thinned out, he came over, hands in his pockets, voice low but clear. "Mom, I'm sorry. No performance, no excuses." I was wrong. I looked at my son, the man who once treated apologizing like a stain, now bowing the right way. I didn't rush to hug him. I set a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Growing up is about paying a price, not getting revenge. You're on the right road." He nodded. In his eyes, I saw a light I'd once seen in Grant's, the light of someone who fell and stood back up. That afternoon, Tessa came too. No expensive bouquet, no heavy perfume. Just a business card. Tessa Grant, Event Coordinator, Norwalk Center. Her voice was lower, steady. "I've closed all the credit cards. I'm learning to live on a real paycheck." I looked at the woman who, to me, had been a symbol of vanity, now standing with tired honesty. I didn't say much. "Good." I nodded. Only when you stop borrowing from someone else's future can you start building your own present. She dipped her head. I saw her lip tremble not to play a part. For the first time, I believed she was actually living, not acting. That evening, I invited the family for a small dinner. No champagne, no white tablecloth, no fussy European courses. Just pumpkin soup, crisp toast, and the chocolate mousse I'd made. Maya brought her violin and played a slow Clair de Lune, and Owen told how his team won the regional tournament. No one talked about money. No one brought up blame. We just sat together. For the first time in years, I felt I wasn't the host, and I wasn't the audience. I was simply present, whole, and calm. Late at night, after everyone left, I sat at the table and wrote one last letter to Grant. "My love, I've learned to say no, not out of anger, but to protect the part of me that hasn't broken. I understand now, when we know our limits, our love doesn't shrink, it reaches farther. Our love isn't only in the old apartment or the savings account anymore. It's being portioned into scholarships, clinics, and children. We don't know who carry the dreams you believed in." I stopped trying to be the good mom who erases herself and started being a good person, the real kind. Thank you for teaching me how to be strong without being bitter. I'm free now, a freedom with responsibility. I folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box with Grant's old watch. A closing ritual, light as a breath. On New Year's Eve, I wrote the year-end lines in my journal. Freedom doesn't come from having or not having money. Freedom comes when we can draw boundaries and still keep gratitude. Rich or poor, love or hurt, gratitude is the only currency that can hold a family together. I closed the book. Warm kitchen light washed the wall, reflecting the years gone by. I stood, turned off the stove, and opened the window. The city breathed with me, each gust like a heartbeat waking up. No demands, no fear, just the real warmth of the present. I poured a little more orange blossom tea and smiled to myself. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything: my child, my family, my love. But it turns out only when the false things fall away do we make room for what's real. I touched Grant's photo, then looked out the window at New York, the sky turning bronze in a spring sunset. And in that light, I heard my own voice, steady and calm. "My name is Estelle Grant. I'm 68. I'm no longer afraid of being alone. Because I know people who I know how to love themselves are never truly alone." Thank you for staying with me to the end of my story. I'm curious, what city are you listening from? From a bright kitchen in New York, or from some quiet corner of the world? If this story touched something in you or brought to mind someone who loved but didn't know how to hold on, leave a comment below. Every share is a way to tell each other, "I understand, and you're not alone." And if you want to walk with me into the next chapters where we talk about aging, awakening, and the slow rebirths of the heart, tap like, subscribe, or simply stay here a little longer. I'm grateful you're here, because somewhere in this noisy city, we can still listen to one another with a story and a heart that's still warm.
She doesn't need to look at the menu. Elaine Bennett smiled at the waiter. Just give her the simplest dish. I looked up. My son stayed silent. My daughter-in-law avoided my eyes. In that moment, I understood a bitter truth. I wasn't invited here as a mother. I was invited as a problem to be handled. I nodded, smiled, and said nothing. They had no idea that the woman wearing this old dress had signed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. And they knew even less. Tonight, I didn't come here to eat dinner. I came to see who they really were. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. The restaurant sat on the top floor of a historic hotel in downtown Boston, where the red brick exterior stood in stark contrast to the luxurious interior. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables draped in crisp white linen. The silverware arranged with such precision it felt almost impersonal. Through the large glass windows behind our table, I could see the Charles River shimmering at night, the lights reflecting on the water like memories that refused to fade. This was the first time I was meeting Claire's parents, my daughter-in-law's parents, and also the first time in many years that I felt this out of place. I sat upright in the soft leather chair, my hands resting lightly on my lap. My old, worn fabric bag hung neatly on the back of the chair. The dress I was wearing was ash gray, simple in style, one I had owned for many years. It wasn't ugly, but it clearly didn't belong here. I knew that the moment I walked in and felt the glances sweep over me, quick, cold, and full of judgment. Andrew, my son, sat to my right. He was 36 now, a grown man with a steady job, broad shoulders, straight posture. But at that moment, he was staring down into his water glass as if it held the answer to all his troubles. I recognized that habit from when he was a child. When Andrew went quiet like that, it meant he was avoiding something. Claire sat to Andrew's left wearing a navy blue dress that fit her perfectly, elegant without being flashy. She was beautiful in the way fashion magazines love. Bright face, softly curled brown hair, just enough makeup. But since we sat down, Claire had barely looked at me for more than a second. Every time our eyes met, she quickly looked away, pretending to adjust her napkin, check her phone, or gaze out the window. Across from me sat Elaine Bennett. She was in her early 60s, her light blonde hair carefully styled, not a strand out of place. The jewelry she wore wasn't large, but one glance was enough for me to know it was far from inexpensive. Every movement Elaine made carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, favored, and taken seriously. Beside her was Thomas Bennett, her husband, a man with a deep voice and the demeanor of someone used to making decisions. He didn't speak much, but every sentence was short and firm, as if no one would think to challenge him. Elaine's comment to the waiter came the moment we lifted our menus. Her tone was gentle, almost caring, but I had lived long enough to know that some words don't need to be loud to wound deeply. Just give her the simplest dish. She didn't ask what I wanted. She didn't look at me to confirm. She didn't treat me as someone with the right to choose. I looked up instinctively, my gaze passing over everyone at the table. Andrew remained silent. Claire lightly bit her lower lip. Elaine smiled, satisfied. Thomas took a sip of water, not participating, but not stopping it either. And in that moment, something became crystal clear in my mind, sharp as a freshly cleaned mirror. I wasn't invited here as Andrew's mother. I was invited here to be evaluated. I felt a faint heat rise up my neck, but I took a deep breath and steadied my breathing. I had learned this a long time ago, in boardrooms, in tense negotiations, in situations where a single emotional misstep could cost you everything. I nodded to the waiter and smiled politely. Yes, that's fine. Elaine's smile widened just a little, as if she had done something right. The waiter folded the menus, bowed slightly, and walked away. I knew that if at that moment I had said, "No, I'd like to see the menu," or "I can choose for myself," the atmosphere at the table would have shifted instantly. But I didn't. Not because I was weak, but because I was curious. I wanted to see how far they would go if I let everything unfold the way they wanted it to. I began to observe. Thomas talked about their recent trip to Napa Valley, his voice even but unmistakably proud. Elaine followed, describing a charity fundraiser where she met very valuable connections. Claire nodded along with her mother's story, occasionally adding small details as if to prove she belonged in that world too. Andrew only spoke when directly addressed, and his answers were shorter than usual. I looked at my son, and a heavy feeling rose in my chest. Not anger, but disappointment. Not disappointment that Andrew didn't defend me, but because I realized he was ashamed. No one said it out loud, but I could see it clearly in the way Andrew avoided my eyes, in how he adjusted his collar whenever Elaine glanced at me, in the tension visible in his hands clasped together under the table. I suddenly understood that, in the Bennett family's eyes, I wasn't just Andrew's mother. I was a variable that didn't fit the picture they had painted for their son's life. A simple mother, a past that needed to be softened, a detail that should be controlled. The thought made my chest ache, but I didn't show it. I was used to being judged by appearances. I was used to being placed into neat little boxes that made other people comfortable. It was just that. It had been a very long time since I had been sitting on this side of the table. I looked at the glass in front of me, the light reflecting off its clear surface, distorting my own image. The woman in the old dress looked calm, almost harmless. If they knew that this woman had once led meetings where hundreds of people sat in silence waiting for her to speak, if they knew that she had signed contracts capable of changing the lives of thousands of people, if they knew... I quietly clenched my hands. No, tonight was not the time for them to know. Tonight, I wanted to see every layer of their masks. I wanted to see how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer them. And when the appetizer arrived, a small, simple portion placed in front of me while elaborate, artfully presented plates were set before everyone else, I knew my decision to stay silent had been the right one. This wouldn't be just a dinner. This was when I began to remember every look, every word, every polite but cold smile. Because sometimes the only way to truly understand a person is to let them believe you are nothing at all. When the appetizer was set in front of me, I kept the same polite smile. But inside, a different stream of thought was quietly unfolding. Not for them, but for those listening to this story. Perhaps it was time I said something that, for many years, only I and very few people in my professional circle had known. I am not the woman Andrew, my son, thinks I am. For more than 20 years, I have held a senior executive position at a multinational corporation, headquartered in the United States, operating across major markets in North America and Europe. My work isn't glamorous in the way that makes headlines, but every decision I sign involves millions of dollars, sometimes the livelihoods of entire chains of people I've never met. I am used to closed-door meetings, negotiations that stretch late into the night, and the pressure of always having to be sharp and precise. My income, to be blunt, is far higher than anyone would imagine looking at the old dress I'm wearing tonight. Each month, the number alone would make many people pause. Beyond my salary, I hold company shares, long-term investments in retirement funds, commercial real estate, and several early-stage projects I joined when few believed they would succeed. My bank account has never been something I worry about, even during the most difficult economic periods. But Andrew doesn't know any of that. My son grew up believing his mother was just a long-time administrative employee at an ordinary company, a woman who went to work regularly, came home on time, lived in a small apartment, and never talked about money. And that wasn't because I lied. I simply didn't say more. I've lived in the same 2-bedroom apartment for nearly 20 years. It's in a quiet neighborhood, not upscale, but clean and safe. The old elevator creaks every time it goes up or down. The hallway is narrow, the yellow lights slightly dim. There's no large balcony, no floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. But there's enough morning light, a compact kitchen, and a living room big enough for an old sofa and a bookshelf filled with books I've read many times. I could have moved long ago. In fact, real estate agents have called me more times than I can count, pitching Riverview penthouses and townhouses in expensive neighborhoods where the annual property tax alone could support another family comfortably. But every time I declined. Not because I'm stingy, but because I don't see the need. I grew up poor, not the romantic kind of poverty you see in inspirational stories, but the kind that forces you to count every dollar, every meal. I lived in cramped rentals, wore old shoes to school, watched my mother work herself to exhaustion just to make sure I didn't have to drop out. Those years taught me something very early. Money can bring security, but showing it off rarely brings peace. When I first began making real money, I was tempted. I won't deny that. I stood in luxury stores, considered buying a car far more expensive than I needed, imagined living in a space that would make others admire me. But each time I asked myself, am I buying this because I need it or because I want to prove something? The answer wasn't always comfortable. And then I realized that the greatest freedom money gives me isn't the ability to buy anything I want, but the ability not to buy what I don't need. I deliberately kept Andrew away from those privileges, not because I didn't love him, but because I loved him too much. I didn't want him to grow up feeling like his path had already been paved. I wanted him to understand the value of work, effort, and taking responsibility for his own life. Andrew went to school on scholarships. He worked part-time during college. He complained about boring jobs, difficult bosses, mornings he had to wake up early even when he didn't want to. I listened, but I didn't intervene. I didn't call anyone to help him. I didn't use my connections to open doors in advance. I raised my son with discipline and consistency. Andrew knew there were things he had to do himself, consequences he had to face on his own. I didn't cushion him with money, and I didn't turn myself into a lifeline every time things got hard. I was always there, but behind him, not in front of him. Perhaps that's why Andrew always thought of me as just an ordinary woman, a kind but somewhat strict mother, living so simply that it sometimes made him feel embarrassed. And I let him think that. I never tried to correct that impression, not because I feared the truth, but because I feared the consequences of telling it. I was afraid that if Andrew knew who I truly was in the outside world, our relationship would change. I feared he would look at me differently, not as his mother, but as a mother with money. I feared his decisions might be influenced even slightly by the existence of an invisible safety net. And until recently, my life was peaceful that way. I went to work, came home, read books, took walks on weekend mornings. Andrew visited when he could. We ate dinner together in my small kitchen. No talk of money, no unspoken comparisons, no tension. Everything began to change when Andrew got married. The Bennett family entered my life very clearly. They were nothing like me. They were used to displaying their status, to social relationships built on financial foundations, to measuring people by what they owned. From the first stories Andrew told me about them, I sensed the difference. And tonight's dinner was the first test, not just for them, but for me. I wanted to know how they would treat me when they believed I had nothing to offer. I wanted to know, without money standing between us, what a person's value looked like in their eyes. The Bennett family entered my life as a test I never sought, but never intended to avoid. And as I sat there, the simplest dish on the table placed in front of me, I understood that the peace I once had was likely over. But sometimes, peace has to be broken, so the truth can finally step into the light. Andrew's call came on a late afternoon, just as I set the kettle down on the stove and leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the small street below. Boston's sky that day was a pale gray, not raining but not sunny either, the kind of in-between weather the city is known for during the changing seasons. I remember thinking, before answering, that it would probably be another short call, asking about my health, reminding me to dress warmly or saying he'd be busy that weekend. Andrew's voice came through the line with a slight hesitation, subtle enough that most people might miss it, but I didn't. "Mom, I want to tell you something." I leaned back against the wall, holding the phone close to my ear. "Okay, go ahead." "Claire's parents, they're in Boston this week, and they want to meet you." I stayed silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because I had always known this moment would come. Andrew had been married for almost a year, and the two families meeting was only a matter of time. But the way he said it, almost as if he were asking for permission, as if he were testing my reaction, caught my attention. "Where do they want to meet?" I asked calmly. Andrew took a light breath, then said the name of the restaurant. It was a name I knew very well, not because I had eaten there, but because, in the business world, it was often mentioned as a symbol of status. One of the most expensive restaurants in Boston, a place people didn't go just to eat, but to be seen and to be recognized. I looked out the window again, street lights beginning to turn on one by one. "That restaurant?" I said, giving nothing away. "That's fine." Andrew seemed relieved that I agreed so quickly. He went on about the time, about how Claire had made the reservation, about how it would be an intimate dinner. I listened, nodding out of habit, until a thought surfaced in my mind, quiet but impossible to ignore. "Andrew," I said, interrupting him, "what do Claire's parents know about me?" There was a very brief pause on the other end of the line. So brief that, if I hadn't known Andrew so well, I might not have noticed it. But I know every breath my son takes. "Well, I just told them you live simply," Andrew replied. "You know, you've always lived that way." The word simply was spoken lightly, as if it were obvious, as if it were a harmless description, but it landed on me heavier than Andrew realized. Simply. Not works at a corporation, not raised her son on her own, not is a strong woman, just simply. In that moment, something tightened in my chest. Not anger, but sadness. A quiet, familiar sadness, like realizing you've been neatly placed into a corner, not because you belong there, but because someone else thinks that's where you fit best. I didn't say anything right away. I let Andrew keep explaining that Claire's parents were fairly traditional, that they cared about appearances, that they just wanted a pleasant dinner. Andrew didn't say it outright, but I could hear a very clear hope in his words. He hoped I wouldn't make things complicated. And I understood. I understood that on some level my son was embarrassed by me. Not embarrassed because I was a bad person, but embarrassed because I didn't fit into the new world he was stepping into. That realization didn't hit me all at once. It came slowly, like rereading an old letter, and suddenly understanding the lines between the lines. I remembered the times Andrew suggested I buy newer clothes before attending events, the times he gently reminded me not to talk too much about my everyday life in front of his friends. Small details I had once brushed off, now rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. I didn't blame Andrew. If there is one thing I've learned in this life, it's this. Children don't mean to hurt their parents. They are only trying to find their place in the world, and sometimes in that process, they unconsciously push the people they love aside. "Okay," I said finally, my voice still gentle. "I understand." Andrew exhaled, clearly relieved. He added a few words about hoping I'd arrive on time, then said goodbye and hung up. I stood there for a long time after the phone screen went dark. My apartment was so quiet I could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock. I looked around the room, the old but clean sofa, the dark wooden bookshelf, the small dining table just big enough for two. Everything here was familiar, marked by a life that wasn't flashy, but never lacking either. I walked slowly into the bedroom and opened my closet. On one side were the clothes I wore every day, simple, durable, easy to wash. Toward the back, carefully hidden, were the clothes I wore for work. Tailored suits, silk blouses, good leather shoes, two worlds coexisting in the same space, rarely touching. I sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on my knees, and for the first time since Andrew called, I allowed myself to think more deeply about the question that had just been asked. What did they know about me? The answer was simple. They only knew what Andrew wanted them to know. And that led me to another thought, one that made me furrow my brow, then let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. If they think I'm a simple woman, then I'll be a simple woman. Not because I want to deceive anyone, but because I want to see the truth. I want to know how they will treat me when they believe I have no money, no power, no connections that benefit them. I want to know, behind the polite smiles and flowery words, where a person's true value really lies in their eyes. At first, that thought made me feel a little cruel. But then I remembered how it felt to hear the word simple used almost as an apology on my behalf. I remembered Andrew's averted gaze, and I understood that sometimes, to protect yourself, you have to allow the truth to reveal itself instead of rushing to shield it. I stood up and closed the closet door. In the mirror, I saw an older woman, her face lined with wrinkles, her expression calm. No one could guess what she had lived through or what she held in her hands, and perhaps that was my greatest advantage. I decided I wouldn't explain anything more to Andrew. I wouldn't call back to clarify who I was or what I did. I would go to that dinner exactly as they had already imagined me, and let the truth reveal itself, not through words, but through how they treated me. That evening, after deciding to let the truth unfold in its own way, I did nothing more than tidy the kitchen, wash the half-finished teacup, and turn off some of the lights in the apartment. But that night, I didn't sleep deeply. Not because I was worried, but because my mind kept replaying very old images, moments I thought I had long forgotten. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains, laying a soft yellow glow across the floor. The apartment was as quiet as ever, unchanged. But I knew that from this day on, something inside me was different. I opened the closet. In front were the clothes I wore every day. Neutral sweaters, simple trousers, dresses that never went out of style but never stood out either. Pushed neatly to the back was a small space where I kept things I rarely used. Hanging there was a gray dress, faded with time. That dress had been with me through many stages of my life. I bought it more than 10 years ago when I still had to think carefully about every expense. It wasn't ugly, just painfully ordinary. The fabric had softened from countless washes, the stitching at the hem no longer sharp. I had meant to give it away for years, but each time I hesitated and hung it back in its place. I pulled the dress out and laid it on the bed. Just looking at it, I knew this was exactly what I needed. I chose an old pair of shoes from the corner of the shoe rack. The soles were worn, the shine long gone. I bent down and brushed a thin layer of dust from the toes. They weren't torn or broken, but they clearly weren't something you'd wear to a fine restaurant. In the bathroom, I tied my hair neatly back, a simple style, nothing elaborate. I looked at the small makeup case on the shelf, the one I used for work, but then I closed it. No lipstick, no powder, no attempt to hide the wrinkles that had been there for years. I took my watch off my wrist and placed it in the drawer. No rings, no necklace, no earrings. My hands were bare, looking thinner without any adornment. I knew that in the world of people like the Bennett family, those small details could say a great deal. I took the old fabric bag hanging behind the door. The straps were frayed, the color uneven. I opened it and checked inside. Aside from my wallet, keys, and phone, I put in only one regular credit card, the kind I almost never used for work. It was enough for everyday expenses, nothing more. The black card was in a different wallet. I opened the nightstand drawer and took it out, looking at it for a long moment. The muted black surface reflected the dim light of the room. I didn't hesitate, but I didn't rush either. I slid it into the hidden inner pocket of the bag, where no one would see it unless I chose to take it out. Everything was ready. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bedroom. The woman looking back at me was a version of myself I barely recognized. The gray dress revealed a figure no longer as straight as it once was. The worn shoes made my stance look heavier. My unmade face showed every wrinkle, every mark left by time. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I had never looked like this. On the contrary, I had been this woman for a very long stretch of my life. But it had been many years since I had consciously chosen to become her again. A strange feeling rose in my chest, as if I were deliberately stripping away everything I had built, returning to an old, forgotten starting point. The feeling of having my value erased came quickly and vividly. I knew that the moment I stepped outside like this, many people would automatically look at me differently, with less respect, with less patience, with less willingness to listen. I placed my hand on the cold mirror and looked straight into my own eyes. Those eyes were still mine, not afraid, not uncertain. Only the outer layer had changed. How they judge me, I whispered softly, is their choice. That sentence wasn't meant to comfort me. It was a reminder. I can't control what others think, but I can control how I respond to it. I wasn't doing this to diminish myself. I was doing this to understand them better. When I put on my coat and stepped out of the apartment, the familiar hallway greeted me with the smell of old paint and the soft yellow light. Don, the morning doorman, nodded at me as he did every day. "Good morning, Mrs. Lawson," he said with a friendly smile. "Good morning, Don," I replied naturally. He didn't look at me any differently. No one here ever did. To them, I was still just the woman in apartment 403 who always greeted people politely and paid her rent on time. And in that moment, I suddenly realized real respect doesn't come from what I'm hiding in my bag, but from how I've lived all these years. But I also knew that once I stepped into the world of the Bennett family, that wouldn't be true anymore. On the way to the restaurant, I chose to take a taxi instead of driving, not because I needed to, but because I wanted everything to stay consistent with the role I had chosen. The driver didn't ask many questions. He turned on the radio, an old song playing softly. I looked out the window as the city passed by. Familiar buildings, busy people, each carrying their own story. I took a deep breath when the car stopped in front of the hotel where the restaurant was located. The entrance was paved with gleaming stone. The staff stood upright in tailored suits. I stepped out of the car, gripping the strap of my fabric bag tightly. In that moment, I felt like I was stepping onto a stage where I had already chosen my role. Not the role of the winner, not the role of the wealthy, but the role of the underestimated. And I was ready. Ready to be looked down on. Ready to be placed into convenient boxes. Ready to hear things they would never say if they knew who I really was. I walked inside, blending into the lights, the voices, the refined scent of the restaurant. Inside me, there was no anger, no bitterness, only a very clear awareness. I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was trading away. And more importantly, I knew that when tonight was over, it wouldn't be only them who would be exposed. I would see myself as well, not through the lens of power or money, but through how I faced being seen as less and still kept my dignity. The moment I stepped through the glass doors of the restaurant, I felt the first gaze fall on me. It wasn't a direct stare, nor was it outright rude. It was the kind of glance that skimmed quickly, then lingered a beat too long, long enough to assess, long enough to categorize. The host, dressed in a neat black suit, smiled politely, but the smile was just slightly delayed, as if his mind were processing something that didn't quite fit. The old dress, the worn shoes, the faded fabric bag, in a space where everything else was polished and carefully curated. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" His voice was still courteous, but his eyes passed over me once more. "Yes," I replied calmly. "The Bennett family." There was a very subtle shift in his expression, not surprise, but adjustment. He nodded and gestured for me to follow. I walked slowly past tightly spaced tables, the soft clink of cutlery against plates, the low murmur of conversation flowing like an unbroken current. And then I saw Andrew. My son stood up the moment he saw me approaching. But the movement was incomplete. He rose, then hesitated, as if unsure what to do next. Andrew's eyes flicked quickly over me, from the dress to the shoes, then turned away almost immediately. In that instant, I saw the unease clearly on the face I had looked at for more than 30 years. Not unease at seeing his mother, but unease because his mother appeared exactly as he had described her to others. Claire stood beside Andrew. My daughter-in-law looked radiant in the way this place favored. Her dress was finely cut, understated but clearly tailored. Her hair was softly styled, her makeup just enough to highlight her youth. But when Claire's eyes met mine, the smile on her lips didn't reach her eyes. "Hello, Mom," Claire said, stepping forward to hug me very quickly, very lightly. That hug felt more like a formality than a gesture of affection. "Hello, dear," I replied, my voice as gentle as always. Elaine Bennett was the next person I noticed. She sat upright in her chair, both hands neatly placed on the table. As I came closer, Elaine lifted her head, her eyes traveling from the top of my hair down to the hem of my dress, then stopping at the fabric bag hanging from my arm. She didn't speak right away. She simply observed. Thomas Bennett stood up last. He shook my hand, brief and firm, but without any warmth. A polite handshake, nothing more. "Very nice to meet you," Thomas said. "Andrew has told us a few things about you." "I hope they were good things," I smiled. He smiled back but didn't answer directly. We sat down. My chair was placed slightly off-center, not at the head of the table. A small detail, but I noticed it. Elaine adjusted her napkin, then turned to me. "Was the trip here smooth?" she asked, her tone light, just concerned enough. "Quite smooth," I replied. "Boston traffic has been very heavy lately," she continued, "especially for people who aren't used to driving downtown." The comment wasn't exactly insulting, but it carried an assumption that I was easily overwhelmed by this city, by this pace of life. I simply nodded, offering no objection. Thomas signaled the waiter to bring wine. He began talking about a bottle of red that had just arrived, emphasizing the vintage, the vineyard, and how difficult it was to find on the market. Elaine nodded along, adding a few details about their recent trip to California, where they had happened to look at some coastal properties. "We're considering buying another one," Elaine said casually. "You never know, Andrew and Claire might need it someday." Andrew hesitated slightly. Claire smiled, but there was tension in it. I sat there, listening, not interrupting. I knew this style of conversation well. It wasn't meant to share. It was meant to establish position, to remind everyone at the table who had the ability to give and who should be aware of that. Elaine turned to me. "Where do you live again?" she asked. "On the west side of the city," I replied. "Oh," Elaine nodded. "That area is quite quiet, very suitable for people who value stability." Stability, another word chosen with care. "What kind of work do you do?" Thomas asked next, his tone neutral. "I work in an office," I said briefly, just as Andrew had painted the picture. "Ah," Elaine smiled. "Jobs like that are very respectable. Not everyone needs high-pressure positions. What matters is having a balanced life." That compliment landed softly, but I heard every word. It wasn't recognition. It was placement, as if she were setting me on a lower rung of a ladder, then nodding in satisfaction because I knew my place. The waiter brought the menus. Elaine glanced through hers quickly, then began ordering for the table. When it came to me, she turned to the waiter and smiled. "She'll have the simplest dish. She probably isn't used to menus like this." The sentence was delivered so gently that anyone who reacted would seem overly sensitive. But I saw Andrew clench his hand under the table. Claire lowered her head. My dish arrived first. A small portion, simply presented. No elaborate garnish, no complex sauce. Meanwhile, in front of the others were carefully arranged plates, rich aromas drifting upward. Thomas took a sip of wine and continued talking about a new project, about people he had recently met, about very promising connections. Elaine added a few remarks, emphasizing names and places that, if I wanted to, I could easily have commented on. But I didn't. I stayed silent. And I remembered. I remembered the way Elaine looked at me whenever money was mentioned. I remembered Thomas's eyes when power came up. I remembered Andrew's silence and Claire's hesitation. The atmosphere at the table grew heavier. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Conversations about money, success, and status flowed past me like a prolonged test. And I sat there, In my old dress with the cheapest dish on the table, listening to every soft word lined with hidden thorns, I knew this was only the beginning. When the plates were nearly cleared, Elaine Bennett was the first to set her knife and fork down. The gesture was light and proper, but I recognized it as a signal. She turned to me, her face relaxing into a gentler smile than before, the kind people use when they're about to say something they believe is for your own good. "Margaret," Elaine began slowly, as if choosing her words with care, "I just want to say, we truly admire you." I looked up calmly. The word admire sounded pleasant, but I had long learned to distinguish between words and the intentions behind them. "Raising a child on your own is never easy," she continued, "especially under circumstances when not everyone has many resources." The way she hesitated before the word resources caught my attention. No one at the table reacted. Thomas sipped his wine. Andrew shifted slightly in his chair. Claire stared down at her napkin. "I've always told Thomas," Elaine went on, "that women like you deserve respect, strong, enduring. But because of that, we do worry." "Worry?" I asked softly. "Yes," Elaine nodded. "You know, age eventually comes for all of us. Health, medical expenses, unexpected things. When you're young, you can manage, but later on..." She let the sentence trail off, then glanced at Andrew. "Andrew is a good son, very responsible. We can see that clearly." Andrew flinched slightly, as if he hadn't expected to be pulled into the conversation this way. He sat up straighter, but tension showed in his eyes. "He always puts others first," Thomas added, his voice low and steady. "And that's exactly why we think some things should be arranged early." I said nothing. I rested my hand on the edge of the table and listened. "Andrew and Claire have their whole future ahead of them," Thomas continued, looking at his son seriously. "Careers, family, children. We want them to focus on building their lives without being distracted by unnecessary pressures." "Unnecessary pressures," I heard the phrase clearly. Elaine nodded, then turned back to me. "Margaret, you understand what we're saying, don't you?" I understood, very clearly. "We've discussed it," Elaine went on, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "And we thought that if we could offer you a bit of financial support, everyone would feel more at ease." Andrew turned to me. "Mom." "Andrew." Elaine placed a hand on her son's arm, her voice softening. "We're just talking." Claire remained silent. She didn't look at me, and she didn't look at her parents either. Her gaze rested on the edge of the table, where subtle patterns ran like a road with no turn. "You mean," I asked, though I already knew the answer. "We were thinking," Elaine said, "a monthly allowance. Nothing big. Just enough to help you feel more comfortable, so you won't have to worry about future expenses." Thomas nodded. "Family support. No strings attached." No strings attached. I almost smiled at the choice of words. "Of course," Elaine added, as if suddenly remembering something. "We also think that given the current situation, it might be better if you didn't visit too often. Andrew and Claire need their own space. Young couples, you understand." And that was when the unspoken condition became clear, bright under the table lights. Money in exchange for disappearance. No one said it outright, but it didn't need to be said. The intention hung between us, heavy and cold. I looked at Elaine. She still wore her smile, but there was careful calculation in her eyes. I looked at Thomas. He wasn't smiling, but his gaze was firm, as if this were a reasonable, generous offer. I realized then that, in their minds, I wasn't Andrew's mother. I was a variable, a risk factor to be managed early, not with understanding, but with money. Andrew began shifting in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. I don't think he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. Andrew, Thomas cut in, his tone firmer. We're talking about long-term planning, about responsibility. I looked at my son. Conflict was written all over his face. On one side were his in-laws, helping him in his career and life. On the other side was me. And in between was Claire's silence. My daughter-in-law said nothing. She didn't object. She didn't agree. She was simply quiet. That silence, in its own way, weighed heavier than words. I turned back to Elaine. "You want me to keep my distance?" I asked lightly, as if confirming a small detail. Elaine tilted her head slightly. "Just more appropriate for everyone." Appropriate. I nodded slowly. "And that allowance. How much would it be?" Andrew looked at me in surprise. Perhaps he expected me to refuse immediately. Perhaps he thought I would react, but I didn't. Elaine seemed relieved that I didn't push back. "We're thinking a modest amount, but enough so you won't have to worry." Thomas added, reinforcing it. "We don't want you to feel abandoned. We just want things to be clear." Clear. In my mind, everything suddenly became very sharp. Not because I was angry, but because the final picture had come together. They didn't believe they were doing something wrong. In their value system, this was a civilized solution. They use money to buy peace of mind, to buy order, to buy distance. And they believed that I, in my old dress, with the cheapest dish on the table, would be grateful for it. I didn't answer right away. I lowered my gaze, picked up my glass of water, and took a small sip. The cool water slid down my throat, helping me keep my voice steady. "Your offer is very thoughtful," I said at last. Andrew looked at me, confused. Claire lifted her head for the first time since the dinner began. Elaine smiled, clearly thinking she was on the right path. "I need some time to think," I added. "Things like this shouldn't be decided in a hurry." "Of course," Elaine replied immediately, unable to hide her satisfaction. "We just wanted you to know that we're always ready to help." Help. I nodded and set the glass down. In that moment, I knew I had what I needed. Not an answer, but confirmation. I had seen the true nature of this offer. I had seen how far they were willing to go if they believed I was the weaker one. And I also knew that the best thing I could do now was to let them keep talking, to keep revealing themselves, to keep believing they were in control. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to hear more, until there was no doubt left about who they truly were. I placed my hand on the table, not to claim space, but to steady myself. Their words still hung between us, heavy like smoke after a small fire. Elaine sat upright. Thomas leaned slightly forward. Andrew watched me as if waiting for a verdict. And Claire was quiet in a way that told me she knew this dinner was about to turn in another direction. "I'll tell you a story," I said, my voice calm, not loud, not emphasized, not to argue and not to justify myself, just so you understand where I come from. No one interrupted. I looked down at my hands that had worked all their lives, faint calluses softened by time, but the memory of them never fading. "I grew up in an old rental building in the southern part of the state," I began. "My parents worked themselves to exhaustion, and there was never enough money. I learned very early that if I wanted to survive, I had to stand on my own." I paused briefly, long enough for old images to come back clearly. The small kitchen, the refrigerator that rattled at night, winter mornings when I went to school in a thin coat because there wasn't a thicker one. When Andrew was born, I continued, I was on my own. No family nearby, no support, no safety net, just a newborn baby and an hourly job. Andrew shifted slightly. I knew this part. He'd never heard all of it. I worked from early morning until late at night, I said, not looking directly at my son. 12 hours was normal, some days 14. I carried Andrew to the neighbor's house to ask them to watch him, then ran off to work. I came home when he was already asleep. The next morning, I left again before he woke up. Elaine pressed her lips together slightly. Thomas stopped leaning back in his chair. At night, I continued, when everything was quieter, I studied. I enrolled in evening classes. I borrowed books from the library. I studied in the kitchen under a dim light with a cheap cup of coffee beside me. I looked at Andrew then. You never knew any of that, did you? He shook his head very slightly. I didn't tell you, I said, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want you to grow up thinking things came easily. I wanted you to understand the value of doing things yourself, learning for yourself, standing back up when you fall. I turned back to Elaine and Thomas. I started at the very bottom of a corporation, secretary, then assistant, then junior manager. I had no one backing me, no connections. I had only one thing. I didn't quit. The atmosphere at the table changed noticeably. The clinking of cutlery from nearby tables suddenly felt distant, as if we were sitting in a closed room. I moved up step by step, I said evenly. Each step meant more responsibility, more hours, more difficult decisions. There were nights I came home at 2 a.m., and the next morning I still woke up early to take Andrew to school. I paused and took a deep breath. There were sacrifices you never knew about, opportunities I turned down because I couldn't travel for weeks at a time, positions I accepted later than others because I needed flexible hours to be a mother. Andrew stared at me, as if trying to piece together fragments he'd never had before. And then, I said, one day things began to change. My work was recognized. I was given bigger projects. I learned how to lead, not with authority, but with endurance. I rested my hand on my glass of water, but didn't drink. At this point, I said very slowly, I am one of the senior executives of that corporation. The words dropped onto the table like a heavy object. Andrew opened his mouth but couldn't speak. Claire froze. Elaine looked at me, her eyes for the first time no longer fully controlled. Thomas narrowed his eyes as if recalculating an equation he'd gotten wrong from the start. I'm not saying this to brag, I added as soon as I saw the shift. I'm saying it because perhaps it's time the truth was placed where it belongs. I looked straight at my son. My income is not a small number. Each month, it's enough to buy the house you're living in within just a few years. Andrew went completely still. I could see it clearly. His shoulders sagged, his eyes empty for several long seconds. I knew that in his mind, an entire past was being rewritten. That's impossible, Thomas blurted out, then fell silent. Elaine took a very deep breath. Claire raised a hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide. I've earned that much for many years, I said, without emphasis, without avoidance. And I chose to live the way you've seen, not because I couldn't live differently, but because I didn't need to. The balance of the dinner shifted completely. The earlier concern now felt out of place. The offer of a monthly allowance sounded clumsy, almost ridiculous. Andrew looked at me, his voice rough. Mom, why didn't you tell me? I looked at my son for a long moment. Because I wanted you to become the man you are today, not someone who lives off anyone else, me included. Claire turned to look at her parents. I didn't need to read her thoughts to understand. The world had tilted. Elaine said nothing for a while. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer as soft as before. You hid this. I didn't hide it, I replied gently. I just didn't put it on display. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence gone. We didn't know. I know, I said. And that's why I listened to your offer all the way through. Andrew lowered his head. Claire took a deep breath. No one mentioned money the way they had earlier anymore. The dinner had turned. Not because I raised my voice, not because I was angry, but because my life story, told at the right moment, had exposed another truth. Their initial judgments had been wrong at the root, and I knew that from this moment on, no one at the table would ever be able to look at me the same way again. I didn't speak immediately after finishing my story. Not because I needed to regain my composure, but because I wanted to give them enough time to understand that this dinner no longer belonged to them. Elaine was the first to move. She adjusted her posture, folding her hands together on the table, as if trying to reclaim a sense of control that had just slipped away. Thomas looked at me with an expression completely different from before. No longer the confidence of a man used to deciding, but the caution of someone who had realized he misjudged his opponent. Andrew said nothing. My son looked at me as if seeing a new person, yet wearing the face of the woman who had raised him for decades. In his eyes, I saw confusion mixed with guilt. And Claire. She lowered her head, not out of politeness, but out of shame. I reached into my old fabric bag. That movement made Elaine track every inch of it, her eyes fixed on my hand, as if she feared I might pull out something else that would further overturn the order she knew. I opened the hidden compartment inside the bag, slowly, without haste. Then I placed the black card on the table. I didn't slam it down. I didn't show it off. I simply set it there, directly in front of Elaine. The card lay there, simple, dark, unadorned. But in the world of people like her, it didn't need to say much. It said everything. The air seemed to freeze. Elaine stared at the card for a long time. I saw the exact moment she realized every assumption she'd made had completely collapsed. Thomas swallowed hard, his throat moving slightly. Andrew sucked in a sharp breath. Claire covered her face, then lowered her hand as if unsure what to do with her emotions. I'd like to be very clear about one thing, I said, calmly but firmly. I don't need any allowance. Elaine looked up. Margaret, that's not what I meant. I know what you meant, I cut in, not raising my voice, and that's exactly why I'm refusing. I looked straight at her, not because the amount is small, but because what you offered isn't help, it's a transaction. Thomas frowned. That wasn't our intention. Yes, it was, I said evenly. You just didn't call it by its real name. I gently turned the black card with my fingertip, not to show off, but to make it clear I understood this game very well. You use money to buy peace of mind, to buy distance, to manage things that make you uncomfortable. Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that evening, she couldn't find the right words. I don't blame you for being wealthy, I continued, and I don't blame you for being used to solving problems with money, but I do blame you for seeing me as a problem that needed to be handled. I turned to Thomas. You talked about old age, about financial burdens, but you never once asked what I needed. You just assumed. Then I turned back to Elaine. Your concern, your compliments that sounded kind, they all served one purpose, to place me lower so you could feel like you were the ones giving. Elaine's face reddened, not with anger, but with exposure. I played the role you thought I was, I said slowly. A simple woman, someone not used to places like this, someone who should be grateful just to be invited to the table. Andrew lowered his head. I saw his shoulders tremble slightly. And you treated me exactly the way you treat people you believe are beneath you, I said. Not rudely, not directly, but enough to make them understand their place. Claire looked up, her eyes red. I'm sorry, she said softly, her voice shaking. I shouldn't have stayed silent. I looked at Claire. In her eyes was real shame, not about money, but about behavior. I nodded slightly. That's enough for me to hear. Elaine and Thomas remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because anything they said now would be too late. I signaled the waiter. He stepped over, his eyes flicking briefly to the black card on the table, then immediately becoming far more serious. I'll take the check, I said. Thomas startled. That's not necessary. We invited... I know, I smiled, but tonight I'm treating. The waiter nodded, took the card, and walked away. No one spoke while we waited. The silence now wasn't heavy with tension, but with everyone having to recalibrate their understanding. When the waiter returned, he placed the bill in front of me. The number was clear, undisguised. I didn't look closely. I signed, slipped the card back into my old fabric bag, the same bag that hours earlier had been judged unfit for this place. Andrew looked at the number, then at me. I could see the moment he understood. The monthly allowance they'd offered earlier was, in reality, a very small figure. I stood up, not hurried, not angry. I stood the way I had stood in many important moments of my life, with my back straight and my head held high. I hope, I said, looking at Elaine and Thomas, that if you continue to use money to define people, you'll at least be more careful. I turned to Andrew. My son stood as well, his eyes wet. Mom, he said, but I placed my hand over his, signaling that I understood. We'll talk tonight, I told him, but not here. Finally, I looked at Claire. You still have plenty of time to become the person you want to be. Don't let your silence hurt others. Claire nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. I turned and walked out of the restaurant. The warm lights behind me no longer made me feel small. I walked in my old dress, worn shoes, faded fabric bag, but every step was steady. I left with everything I had brought to the dinner. Not money, not status, but dignity, intact. I arrived back at my apartment when the city lights were fully on. The familiar hallway was quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps. Dawn was still at the desk, looking up to greet me with the same kind smile as every evening. Have a good night, Miss Lawson. Have a peaceful night, I replied, my voice lighter than I expected. When the apartment door closed behind me, I stood still for a long moment, not because I was tired, but because I needed a few minutes to fully feel what had just happened. There was no victory and no bitterness, just a strange sense of relief, as if I'd finally set down a burden I'd been carrying for far too long. I changed out of my dress, poured myself a cup of hot tea, and sat in my familiar chair by the window. The city outside continued to move, countless other stories unfolding in parallel, unaware that at a luxurious restaurant not far away, an order once thought unshakable had been quietly disturbed. My phone vibrated. Andrew's name appeared on the screen. I looked at it for a few seconds before answering. Mom! My son's voice came through, hoarse and rushed, as if he'd been running for a long time. Did you make it home? I did, I replied. Are you okay? On the other end, Andrew was silent for a few beats. I heard him exhale heavily. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything, I said gently. Listening is fine. Mom, he continued, his voice breaking slightly, I'm sorry. Those two words came late, but they weren't meaningless. Sorry for what? I asked, not to pressure him, but to let him face it himself. For letting it happen, Andrew said quickly, as if afraid he'd lose his courage if he slowed down. For introducing you like you were something that needed explaining. For staying silent when they said things they shouldn't have. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Andrew, I said, I'm not angry with you, but I'm angry with myself, he replied. I didn't see it. I thought I was doing the right thing. You're living in a world where things like that are considered normal, I said. I understand. But I don't want to keep living like that, Andrew said, his voice firmer now. Tonight made me rethink a lot. I didn't answer right away. I let my son continue, let him give shape to the thoughts tumbling in his head. I realized, Andrew said more slowly, that a lot of what I've had over the past few years didn't come entirely from me, the contracts, the opportunities, the doors that opened too easily. I opened my eyes and looked out the window. And how does that make you feel? It feels like I'm standing on ground I didn't build myself, he replied. And tonight, I don't want to stand there anymore. I heard something new in my son's voice, a new clarity, not impulsive, not blind rebellion, but a resolve that was taking shape. Have you talked to Claire yet? I asked. Andrew sighed. She left our place a little while ago. She cried a lot. Not long after that, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was Claire. I answered right away. Aunt Margaret, Claire said, her voice trembling but clear. I'm sorry. You've already said that, I replied, and I heard you. But I need to say more, Claire said. I stayed silent when I shouldn't have. I let my parents shape everything, and I didn't dare stand up. You were afraid, I said, not as a question. Yes, Claire admitted. I was afraid of losing their support, afraid of disappointing them. But tonight, when you stood up and said those things, I realized I was more disappointed in myself. I listened. I didn't rush to comfort her, because sometimes what someone needs most isn't reassurance, but the space to face their own emotions. Andrew told me, Claire continued, that he wants to walk his own path, not rely on my father anymore. I stayed silent, letting her go on. I know that will start a big fight, Claire said, her voice lowering. My father, he was very angry. I could picture it clearly. Thomas Bennett wasn't a man accustomed to losing control. To him, Andrew's independence wasn't a personal choice. It was a rejection of influence, and that was the hardest thing for him to accept. And Elaine? I asked. Claire hesitated. My mother. She hasn't said much, but I can see she's worried. Not worried about me, worried about losing her grip on things. I nodded, though Claire couldn't see it. Elaine Bennett was used to arranging other people's lives with gentle words and well-timed support. When that tool stopped working, fear followed. I don't know where this is going, Claire said, but I don't want to go back to how things were. No one knows, I replied, but you've started by looking the truth in the eye. That matters. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time. The aftershocks of that dinner were spreading outward, like ripples on water. Andrew began re-examining his career path, not with pure pride anymore, but with honesty. He told me later that he had turned down a new project Thomas had introduced him to. No argument, just a clear refusal. Thomas reacted harshly. Andrew recounted it, his voice tired but steady. He said I was ungrateful, that I was destroying my own future. "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think," Andrew replied, "that if that future requires me to bow to things I don't believe in, then maybe it's not the future I want." Elaine, according to Claire, began calling more often. No concrete offers anymore, just roundabout questions, reminders about family, about stability. But behind them was a clear fear, losing control over her daughter and son-in-law. I didn't intervene, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if I stepped in too early, every change would be blamed on me. Andrew and Claire needed to stand on their own decisions, to face the conflicts forming around them themselves. I watched from a distance. I listened when Andrew called, when he was confused, when he doubted himself. I listened when Claire talked about the growing tension in her family. I didn't give instructions. I only asked questions, just enough for them to find their own answers. The Bennett family began to crack, not because I spoke the truth, but because that truth exposed fractures that had always been there, merely hidden beneath money and power. And I knew this was only the beginning of a long process. But sometimes all it takes is one dinner and one person willing to stand up with dignity for things to never return to the way they were. 3 days after that dinner, as I was organizing some old files on my desk at home, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I was about to ignore it, but instinct made me answer. "Margaret?" Elaine Bennett's voice came through, lower than I'd ever heard it. May I see you?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window where the late afternoon sunlight was sliding slowly across familiar rooftops. I knew this call would come sooner or later. I just didn't know how. "Where?" I asked. Elaine paused briefly. "At the Fairmont, the afternoon tea lounge downstairs, if that feels appropriate." I understood the choice. A refined setting, her familiar territory, a place where Elaine wouldn't feel completely off balance. "All right," I said, 11 a.m. When I arrived at the Fairmont, the grand lobby still held its familiar elegance. Polished marble floors, high-hanging chandeliers, a faint trace of perfume in the air. I wore something simple but neat, not the old dress and not clothing that made others wary. Just me, plainly. Elaine was already there. She had chosen a table in the corner where she could see the room but still have privacy. When she saw me, she stood up, not rushed, not stiff, just proper. This time, without judgment. "Thank you for coming," Elaine said. "I wanted to hear what you had to say," I replied. We sat down. Tea was brought over. Elaine ordered her usual black tea. I ordered herbal tea. A small detail, but I noticed Elaine's eyes pause there briefly, as if she were wondering how many things she'd missed by always seeing people through fixed frames. "That dinner," Elaine began, then stopped. She took a deep breath. "I was very shocked." "I know," I said. "Not only by the truth about you," Elaine continued, her voice slower now, "but by the way I realized I had behaved. I was ashamed." The word didn't come easily. I could see it in the way she gripped her teacup. "All my life," Elaine said, "I was taught that status is everything. My father always said, if you're not standing above others, they'll step on you. There's no middle ground." She looked off into the distance, as if seeing some old, closed-off room in her memory. I grew up at dinners where adults didn't talk about people, only about their value, where they lived, who knew whom, who owed whom. I didn't interrupt. "From a young age, I learned to observe," Elaine said, "not to understand, but to classify, and I carried that habit into adulthood without realizing it. She looked back at me. When I met you, I did what I knew best. I nodded. You judged. Yes, Elaine admitted. And I was wrong. The air between us was tense, but not hostile, like two people standing before a large mirror, forced to look at the parts they usually avoid. There's something that unsettles me even more, Elaine went on, her voice dropping, when I realized I was jealous of you. I was slightly surprised, but I didn't show it. Not because of money, Elaine said quickly, as if afraid I'd misunderstand, but because of freedom. You don't need anyone's approval. You don't need to show off. You walked into that room, and even though I thought I was above you, in reality, you were the only one who wasn't bound. She gave a thin smile. I've been bound my whole life without realizing it. I set my teacup down. Money, I said, is just a tool. It can build bridges. It can also build walls. The issue isn't the amount, but the purpose people use it for. Elaine listened without interrupting. I've never used money to control others, I continued, not because I'm noble, but because I know how heavy it feels to be controlled. Elaine closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her gaze had changed, not as sharp as before, but something more weary. I thought I was protecting my daughter, she said, but maybe I was just protecting my own position. That's not an easy realization, I replied. Elaine fell silent. After a moment, she spoke very slowly. I'm sorry for the way I treated you. The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't smooth. It carried hesitation, the tension between real regret and the habit of saving face, but I didn't dismiss it. I hear you, I said, but I'm not ready to say everything is fine. Elaine nodded without the defensiveness she'd shown before. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness right away. Forgiveness, I said, isn't something that can be demanded. It comes after change. Elaine looked up. And do you believe I can change? I looked at her for a long time. The woman in front of me was still Elaine Bennett, elegant, wealthy, used to control. But somewhere in her eyes was a small crack, and sometimes that's where light gets in. I believe, I said slowly, that anyone can change, but not everyone is willing to pay the cost. Elaine took a deep breath. I don't want to lose my daughter. I know, I said, and that may be motivation enough. We sat a while longer. We didn't talk about Andrew. We didn't talk about Claire. We talked about very human things, about the fear of aging, about letting go, about realizing you've lived too long by other people's expectations. When we stood to leave, Elaine looked at me. Thank you for meeting me. I didn't meet you to help you, I said. I met you to tell the truth. She nodded. Maybe that's the greatest help. We parted in the hotel lobby. I stepped outside and took in a breath of cool air. I didn't know how much Elaine would change. I wasn't sure where this conversation would lead, but I knew one thing. I hadn't closed the door. Not with hurried forgiveness, but by leaving enough space for change, if it came, to enter. Change didn't arrive all at once, and it wasn't loud. It came slowly, bit by bit, like an old room gradually brightening as someone opens windows that have been shut for too long. Andrew changed the most. A week after my meeting with Elaine, my son called me, his voice far calmer than it had been in those early days of confusion. Mom, he said, I turned down the financial support package from Claire's family. I wasn't surprised, but I stayed silent, letting him continue. They said it was only temporary, Andrew told me, that I didn't need to do this, that everyone benefited. But I realized if I accepted it, then none of my future decisions would really be mine anymore. And how do you feel? I asked. Light, he replied without hesitation. Lighter than I expected. The decision hadn't been easy. Andrew told me about the tense conversation with Thomas. He hadn't yelled or slammed the table, but every word carried carefully wrapped disappointment. He said I was throwing away a prepared future. Andrew said that there are people who spend their whole lives never getting a chance to stand where I stood. And what did you say? I asked. I told him, Andrew replied slowly, that if that future requires me to keep bowing my head to preserve it, then maybe it isn't a future I want to live. Thomas wasn't used to answers like that. From that moment on, his influence began to fade, not because Andrew rebelled, but because Andrew no longer needed his approval. And for people like Thomas, nothing renders them more powerless than losing their central role in someone else's decisions. Andrew started over in a new job, not glamorous, not a salary that made people marvel, a lower position than what he'd once been promised, but one he earned with his own ability. On his first day, Andrew sent me a very short message. I'm tired today, but I feel like I'm standing upright. I smiled when I read it. Claire changed, too, in a quieter way. She didn't make grand declarations. She didn't cut ties completely with her family, but small habits began to shift. Claire told me, during a long afternoon conversation, that she had sold the expensive car her parents had given her and replaced it with a simpler one. Not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to feel more clearly the value of the things she earned herself. I realized, Claire said, that until now I've never really had to think carefully about how I spend money, and that has made me disconnected from real life. She started cooking more. Meals were no longer about ordering from upscale restaurants, but simple dinners, sometimes just soup and bread. Andrew told me that during those meals they talked more, not about big plans, not about opportunities or connections, but about very ordinary things. Elaine, just as I had expected, changed the slowest. She didn't give up her controlling habits overnight, but she began to learn how to pause. Instead of giving advice that wasn't asked for, she asked questions. Instead of arranging things, she listened. Sometimes she simply listened in silence, something she had rarely done before. Claire told me that once Elaine called just to ask, "Are you okay?" and then waited quietly for the answer without adding any reminders afterward. For someone like Elaine, that was a significant step. Thomas was different. He wasn't used to losing influence, not used to having words that once carried weight reduced to mere opinions. He appeared less often in family conversations. When he did show up, he was usually quiet or spoke in short sentences, no longer with the enthusiasm he once had. There were family meals Andrew described where Thomas barely mentioned work, real estate, or powerful acquaintances. Not because he had completely changed, but because no one wanted to listen to those stories anymore. Those meals, according to Claire, felt strange but easy to breathe in. No more showing off. No more half-joking comments about money. Just people sitting at the same table, eating the same food, speaking to one another in their real voices. I didn't appear often at those gatherings, not because I was excluded, but because I chose to keep my distance. I didn't want my presence to become a shadow that made them change because of me, instead of because of themselves. I watched from afar, through phone calls, messages, and stories told back to me. I saw Andrew learn to say no without apologizing. I saw Claire learn to ask questions instead of automatically accepting things. I saw Elaine sometimes confused, but not returning to her old ways. And I saw Thomas gradually being forced to face the truth that power doesn't last forever if it isn't built on respect. The family began to speak honestly with one another, not always gently. There were tense conversations, tears, long silences. But they were real conversations, no longer covered up by gifts or financial support. Respect in that way was rebuilt, not based on who had more money, but on who dared to live according to their own values. And me, I didn't take revenge. I didn't use my truth to overpower anyone. I didn't use money to reverse roles. I didn't step into that family as a winner. I stepped back, letting go of power I fully could have used, because I learned very early on that real power doesn't lie in controlling others, but in not needing to do so. Letting go isn't weakness. Letting go is trusting that others can grow on their own if they are given the space. And in that slow change, I realized something. The values that once stood highest had been turned upside down, not through punishment, but through truth, patience, and each person choosing again the path they wanted to walk. The news that Andrew was about to become a father reached me on a very quiet afternoon. My son called, his voice unable to hide its tremble, even as he tried to sound calm. He spoke slowly, as if afraid that if he spoke too fast, the moment would slip away. "Mom, Claire's pregnant." I was silent for a few seconds, not because I was surprised, but because a very deep, very warm feeling was spreading through my chest. A circle in my life after so many years seemed about to close in the gentlest way. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I am," Andrew replied. "This time, I really am." I smiled, a smile that didn't need forcing. I knew exactly what those words, "really okay," meant. They weren't just about becoming a father, but about having found solid ground for himself, without dependence, without borrowing, without needing anyone's backing. Since that dinner years ago, there have been no more secrets between Andrew and me. We talk to each other like two adults, not with one-sided protection and not with silent gaps. Andrew asks me about my work, about decisions I made in the past. I ask him about his current worries, about the fear of becoming a father, about the pressure of carrying responsibility on his own shoulders. Some evenings we simply sit on the balcony of my small apartment, drinking tea, watching the city lights come on. No one has to prove anything. No one has to play a role. Once, as I was reorganizing my closet, Andrew happened to notice the old gray dress hanging in the far corner. "You still keep it?" he asked. I nodded. That dress is still there. Faded. Ordinary. No longer worn. But I didn't throw it away, not because of attachment, but because it is a marker. A very personal reminder that one evening I walked into a room looking like the person everyone underestimated the most and walked out with my dignity completely intact. I don't keep that dress because of pain. I keep it because of clarity. The years that followed passed more gently than I ever expected. Elaine didn't become a different person overnight, but she learned how to step back. No more arranging, no more deciding for others. There were moments when she still fumbled, still wanted to intervene, but then she stopped. Something she had never done before. Thomas remained Thomas, but his power was no longer the center of every conversation. He learned to be silent more often, even if not always willingly. And sometimes, silence itself is a lesson. Claire changed the most in ways that surprised me. She didn't try to prove she was simple or different. She just lived more honestly, asked more honestly, and dared to say no to things that had once been considered obvious. I stood at the edge of all those changes, not leading, not controlling, not needing recognition. I simply observed with the calm of someone who understands that if something is true, it will stand on its own without anyone holding it up. Some mornings, I wake up very early, make coffee, and sit alone in my small kitchen. I think about the journey I've taken, from a poor young woman to an exhausted single mother, to a woman studying at night under dim light, to a woman sitting in a luxury restaurant without needing to prove who she is. I came to understand one thing. Sometimes the truth needs to be tested, not to hurt others, but to see who truly deserves to stand beside you when all the layers fall away. Wealth, in the end, has never been about the numbers in a bank account. Wealth lies in freedom, the freedom not to bow your head in exchange for acceptance. Wealth lies in dignity, something no one can buy and no one can take away unless you allow it. Now I live true to myself. I don't need to walk into any room to prove my worth. I don't need my title spoken before my words are heard. I don't need money to create distance, and I don't need simplicity to hide strength. I only need to be myself. A mother, a woman about to become a grandmother. Someone who has gone far enough to understand that the greatest wealth in life isn't what you own, but what you don't lose along the way. And if you've stayed with me until these final lines, perhaps somewhere in my story, you've seen a part of yourself. In the silence, in the hard choices, in the desire to be respected for who you truly are. If you'd like, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching this story from. Have you ever been in a moment where your value was misjudged? I would truly love to read your story. If this story touched you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for the stories to come. Thank you, truly, for giving your time, your attention, and your heart to this story.